Welcome back to the Cheating Tales Lab. First of all, a huge thank you for helping us reach 5,000 subscribers. Thank you all for your amazing support. To celebrate, we're launching our second channel, Infidelity Tales Lab, where you'll get one-day early access to all our stories plus exclusive, original cheating wife stories you won't find anywhere else. You can subscribe now by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment, or simply search for Infidelity Tales Lab on YouTube. Don't miss out. Subscribe and listen to exclusive stories. You won't regret subscribing. Now let's begin the story. The setting sun painted golden streaks across the polished marble floors of the Sullivan Mansion's modernist living room. Lawrence Sullivan stood motionless, his tall frame reflected in the same mirror where his wife Patricia was adjusting her dress. The red fabric clung to her curves like a second skin, the neckline plunging well below what any respectable corporate wife would wear to a merger announcement. Lawrence observed her with the same analytical precision that had made him one of Silicon Valley's most formidable CEOs. At 45, he still cut an imposing figure in his tailored charcoal suit. Years of martial arts training and disciplined workout routines had kept him fit, while building Sullivan Technologies into a cybersecurity empire had honed his mind into a weapon sharper than any blade. "You know how important tonight is," he said, his deep voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "The merger announcement requires a certain level of professionalism. That dress sends the wrong message." Patricia's fingers lingered on the fabric, smoothing it over her hips with deliberate slowness. "It's always about your image, isn't it, Lawrence?" She reached for her lipstick, applying another layer of crimson. "God forbid I want to feel beautiful for once. Not everything revolves around Sullivan Technologies." The words hung in the air like poison gas, triggering something in Lawrence's mind. As CEO of the world's leading cybersecurity firm, he'd built his career on detecting patterns. The smallest anomaly could indicate a system breach. Lately, the anomalies in his personal life had been accumulating. Unexplained absences that stretched beyond their stated duration. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered a room. Personal training sessions that always seemed to run late. Credit card charges from hotels in the city where they lived. New jewelry she claimed to have had for years. Instead of responding to her barb, Lawrence checked his phone. A message from Chris Berger, his head of security, confirmed what he needed to know. His private team was in position. He'd hired Chris 8 years ago, recognizing in the former Special Forces operator the same ruthless efficiency he valued in himself. Where Lawrence was subtle steel, Chris was raw iron. Effective, unyielding, and absolutely loyal. "I need to handle some things at the office before the gala," Lawrence said, adjusting his platinum cufflinks, a 5th anniversary gift from Patricia that now felt like a marker of mockery. "I'll meet you there." Patricia barely acknowledged him, too busy with her preparation. Her indifference was new, or perhaps he was only now allowing himself to see it. As he left the room, he activated a secure line to Chris. "Begin Protocol 7, he ordered. "Full surveillance, no limitations. I want eyes and ears on everything." "Sir," Chris's voice held a note of concern. "That level of monitoring, it's unprecedented. The resources require." "Do it. You have complete authorization." "And Chris? This stays between us." Lawrence descended the curved staircase of his home, past the family portraits that now seemed like elaborate props in a staged play. He'd built this life on a foundation of integrity and family values. Sullivan Technologies wasn't just another tech company. It was a legacy he'd intended to pass down to his children. Now, watching his wife prepare for what she thought was a simple corporate gala, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His Tesla waited in the circular driveway, its black surface reflecting the sunset like obsidian. As he slid behind the wheel, another message from Chris lit up his secure phone. "Initial surveillance active. You need to see this." The Sullivan Technologies corporate headquarters dominated the San Francisco skyline, its glass and steel structure a testament to Lawrence's vision. But tonight, he bypassed the executive floor for a secure room 3 levels below ground. Here, surrounded by monitors displaying multiple camera feeds, Lawrence watched his wife's calculated performance at the gala. Patricia had made her entrance 20 minutes ago, the red dress drawing exactly the kind of attention she'd intended. She'd immediately gravitated toward Herman Black, Lawrence's supposed best friend and COO. Through high-resolution cameras and directional microphones, Lawrence observed their interaction with growing coldness. "Come here often, stranger?" Patricia's voice came through crisp and clear as she sidled up to Herman at the bar. Her hand brushed his arm in a gesture too familiar for comfort. Herman's fingers traced her waist, hidden from the crowd by the bar's position. "You're playing a dangerous game tonight, Pat. That dress." "Lawrence still suspects nothing," she whispered, leaning close enough that her lips nearly brushed Herman's ear. "The shell companies are in place. Once the merger goes through next week, everything changes. The accounts are ready?" Herman's voice held equal measures of lust and greed. "Everything's prepared. Sandy confirmed the last transfers yesterday. It's perfect. Lawrence is so busy protecting the company from external threats, he never thought to look inside his own home." Lawrence's fingers tightened on his desk as Chris entered with a tablet. The former operator's face was grim. "Sir, our team has uncovered something bigger than an affair. You need to see this." The evidence unfolded across multiple screens, each revelation more damaging than the last. The merger with Jared Norton's tech firm wasn't an expansion opportunity. It was an elaborate trap designed to hollow out Sullivan Technologies from the inside. Patricia wasn't just sleeping with Herman. She was the central figure in a conspiracy that included Norton, Herman, and even Lawrence's own brother, Guillermo. "There's more," Chris said, pulling up another set of files. "Your daughter's recent behavioral issues? The declining grades, the rebellion, the sudden hostility toward you? We've found evidence that Mrs. Sullivan has been deliberately sabotaging your relationship with both children." Surveillance footage played across the screens. Patricia in careful conversation with Mandy's teachers, planting seeds of doubt about Lawrence's commitment to his family. Text messages showed her manipulating situations, staging incidents designed to drive wedges between father and children. She'd even gone as far as intercepting and altering messages between Lawrence and his son Bill at college. "Show me everything," Lawrence commanded, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded hurricanes. "Every detail, every player, every angle." For the next hour, they pieced together a conspiracy that stretched back years. Patricia hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She'd orchestrated a complete infiltration of his life. The cameras continued to show the gala, where she laughed and danced, celebrating what she thought was her imminent victory. The night stretched into early morning as Lawrence dove deeper into encrypted servers and hidden accounts. Each discovery was another betrayal crystallized in data, another crack in the foundation of trust he'd built his life upon. His brother Guillermo had been running ghost projects through the R&D department, siphoning millions through fake research initiatives. The money trail led to offshore accounts, carefully hidden but not invisible to someone with Lawrence's resources. Herman's betrayal went beyond the affair. He'd been selling company secrets to competitors, using the profits to fund a lavish lifestyle that included regular trips with Patricia to private villas in the Mediterranean. Their affair hadn't been a recent development. Bank records showed shared accounts dating back 3 years. Patricia's role was perhaps the most insidious. She'd methodically gathered compromising information on board members, building a blackmail portfolio that would have given her control of the company after Lawrence's planned ouster. She'd used her position as his wife to access information, to build relationships, to plant seeds of doubt about his leadership. But Sandy, his sister-in-law, had been the biggest surprise. She'd constructed an entire shadow company built on stolen Sullivan Technologies patents, preparing to launch competing products the moment Lawrence was removed from power. "Sir," Chris said, returning with another set of files. "We've confirmed the timing. The dress tonight, it wasn't just inappropriate. They're celebrating. The merger announcement was supposed to be the beginning of your end. They think they've won." Lawrence stood, walking to the window that overlooked the sleeping city. In the reflection, he could see the monitors behind him, Patricia and Herman sharing another intimate moment, his brother glad-handing investors, Sandy watching it all with satisfied eyes. "Activate Protocol 0, he said, his voice carrying absolute finality. Chris didn't bother hiding his concern. "Sir, Protocol 0. The collateral damage will be extensive. Personal reputations, careers, families. They chose their fate when they targeted my children. Lawrence turned, his face illuminated by the city lights and the glow of monitors. They didn't just try to steal my company. They tried to steal my legacy. Execute Protocol Zero. Now. Through the cameras, he could still see Patricia laughing with Herman, their hands touching under tables, their confidence complete. They had no idea that Lawrence Sullivan didn't just plan for cyber attacks. He planned for everything. The first phase of Protocol Zero began at midnight. A cascade of encrypted locks on company data, phantom account transfers, and the quiet activation of hidden contract clauses that would trap millions in legal limbo. By the time Patricia danced with Herman to what they thought was their victory song, Lawrence had already seized control of every shell company they'd created. His most trusted assistant, Brooke, worked silently in an adjacent office, gathering evidence and securing his children's futures. Mandy, away at a friend's house, had already been contacted and protected. Bill's college accounts were transferred to secure trusts beyond Patricia's reach. Lawrence watched the final pieces fall into place, remembering Patricia's words from earlier. Maybe I want to feel beautiful for once. She'd never looked uglier to him than she did now, draped over Herman, plotting his destruction. The red dress that had been meant to mark her triumph would instead become the symbol of her downfall. Dawn approached as Lawrence made his final preparations. While Patricia celebrated her imagined victory, divorce papers were being delivered to their home, along with evidence of her crimes carefully distributed to select board members. Lawrence Sullivan, the man she thought she deceived, would be gone. But Lawrence Sullivan, the man who'd built an empire on seeing the patterns others missed, would be very much alive and very, very angry. The night of the gala wouldn't be remembered as the beginning of Lawrence Sullivan's downfall. Instead, it would mark the start of the most meticulously planned revenge in Silicon Valley history. The gala's music pulsed through the grand ballroom of the St. Regis as Lawrence's plan unfolded with mechanical precision. In the building's secure server room, his team of cybersecurity experts executed complex protocols that would seal the conspirators' fate. Lines of code scrolled across screens as company data underwent military-grade encryption, while carefully crafted algorithms began transferring millions into phantom accounts. Through the surveillance feeds, Lawrence watched Patricia twirl in Herman's arms, her red dress a splash of blood against the white marble floor. Neither of them noticed when their phones briefly lost signal, the moment when their access to the shell company's accounts was permanently severed. "Sir, Phase 1 is complete," reported his lead IT specialist. "All offshore accounts have been redirected. The phantom protocols are active." Lawrence nodded, his face illuminated by the blue glow of monitors. "Trigger the contract clauses." Brooke, his executive assistant of 8 years, worked methodically at her station. She'd been gathering evidence for months, having noticed discrepancies in board meeting minutes and irregular patterns in company communications. Now, she was ensuring every piece of documentation was properly secured and backed up on servers that only Lawrence could access. "Mr. Sullivan," Brooke said, looking up from her screen, "Mandy is secure. The security team confirmed she's chosen to leave with you. She's quite angry about what her mother did." A brief flash of emotion crossed Lawrence's face, the only one he'd shown all night. His daughter had inherited his analytical mind. Once presented with evidence of Patricia's manipulation, the altered text messages, the staged conflicts, the deliberate sabotage of father-daughter events, she made her choice with cold clarity. And Bill? The trust is established and funded. His college accounts are secured. He's protected, sir, though he doesn't know everything yet. We thought it best to wait until after his finals. Lawrence turned to Chris, who stood by the door. "Begin Phase 2. While Patricia danced and laughed, believing she was celebrating her impending triumph, Lawrence's team executed a series of precisely timed operations. All company data was locked behind new encryption protocols. Millions in assets were legally transferred through predetermined channels. Hidden contract clauses were activated, giving Lawrence control of the shell companies. Emergency board protocols were initiated, temporarily concentrating power in the CEO position. Surveillance data was secured and backed up to multiple secure locations. By midnight, as Patricia sipped champagne with her co-conspirators, Lawrence had effectively seized control of every asset they thought they'd stolen. The irony of their celebration wasn't lost on him. They were toasting their own destruction. The divorce papers are being delivered now, Brooke confirmed. Along with selected evidence packages to specific board members, Lawrence stood, straightening his tie. Distribute the remaining files as planned. It's time. Before dawn broke over San Francisco, Lawrence Sullivan, the man they thought they'd outsmarted, vanished completely. His disappearance was as meticulous as everything else he did. No trace, no trail, no loose ends. Patricia's homecoming would be her first taste of the new reality. She'd find all accounts emptied or frozen. Divorce papers detailing her infidelity and conspiracy. Evidence of her crimes in the hands of key board members. Her access to company resources completely revoked. Her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The first cracks appeared at dawn. Herman Black stood in his private office, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. Every offshore account empty. Years of carefully hidden funds, gone. His phone buzzed constantly with alerts. Access denied, transfer failed, account suspended. What the hell is happening? He barked into his phone. All pretense of smooth sophistication gone. Fix this. But there was nothing to fix. The money hadn't been stolen. It had been legally reclaimed through a web of contracts and clauses so complex that his lawyers were already getting headaches. Across town, Guillermo Sullivan watched federal auditors march into his department. They carried boxes of documents, detailed records of every ghost project, every fraudulent transaction, every fake research initiative he'd used to embezzle millions. His attempt to call his sister-in-law Sandy went straight to voicemail. Sandy had problems of her own. Her parallel company, built on stolen Sullivan Technologies patents, faced not just litigation but complete annihilation. Emergency injunctions had frozen her assets. Cease and desist orders arrived by the dozen. Her technical team reported that critical data was simply gone. But it was Jared Norton who broke first. The veteran tech executive recognized a lost cause when he saw one. He reached out to federal investigators with an offer. Evidence of Patricia's involvement in industrial espionage in exchange for immunity. His betrayal was quick, complete, and self-serving, exactly what Lawrence had predicted. Patricia's fall was particularly spectacular. Her society friends, who'd once competed for her attention, now wouldn't return her calls. Claudia Martinez, Lawrence's corporate counsel and a pillar of San Francisco society, led the social exodus. The same people who'd admired Patricia's red dress at the gala now whispered about her disgrace at charity functions. I don't know what you're talking about, Herman declared publicly when asked about their relationship. Mrs. Sullivan was simply another board member's wife. These accusations are ridiculous. He'd thrown her under the bus so fast it left skid marks. Watching him deny their relationship on live television, Patricia finally understood. She'd been played for a fool, not by Lawrence, but by her own co-conspirators. Time became Lawrence's greatest weapon. While his enemies expected immediate destruction, he delivered something far more devastating. Slow, systematic dismantling of their lives. Like a master chess player, he'd set up moves that would play out over years. Guillermo's downfall came first. Over 18 months, Lawrence's algorithms orchestrated what appeared to be a series of unfortunate market crashes. Each one targeted his brother's remaining investments with surgical precision. By the end of year 2, Guillermo Sullivan, once a millionaire executive, was selling his house to cover basic expenses. It's just bad luck, Guillermo told his wife, staring at another margin call notice. The market's volatile, but it wasn't luck. It was Lawrence, operating through layers of shells and proxies, using his brother's own greed against him. Every time Guillermo thought he'd found a safe investment, invisible hands would shift the market just enough to destroy him. Sandy's destruction took longer, but proved more complete. Her company weathered the first wave of patent lawsuits, but then strange things began happening. Critical servers failed at crucial moments. Potential clients received anonymous tips about security vulnerabilities. Mysterious cyber attacks exposed just enough of her stolen technology to scare away investors. There's nothing linking these incidents, her security team reported. It's like we're cursed. 3 years in, Sandy's company collapsed under the weight of litigation and technical failures. The industry blacklist followed naturally. No one would hire an executive with her record of incompetence. Herman's reputation died by 1,000 cuts. Evidence of his affairs, not just with Patricia, but with numerous others, leaked to the press in a steady drip. Each revelation was more damaging than the last. His attempts to deny them only made him look worse, especially when time-stamped videos proved his lies. "I assure you, these allegations are completely false," he'd say, only to have photos appear the next day showing exactly what he denied. Patricia's attempts to access Lawrence's fortune met with constant failure. Every legal challenge was met with overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Her lawyers kept quitting as new conflicts of interest mysteriously emerged. Her attempts to sell stories to the press backfired when journalists received proof of her lies. But while his enemies floundered, Lawrence rebuilt. Operating under various aliases and through multiple corporations, he constructed a new empire. His children thrived under his guidance. Mandy discovered her talent for cybersecurity, eventually becoming one of the field's rising stars. Bill excelled in corporate law, his understanding of business enhanced by watching his father's strategic brilliance. Both children understood the truth. Their father hadn't run away. He'd removed them from a toxic environment. Lawrence maintained perfect operational security through it all. Not once in 6 years did his enemies discover his location or new identity. He watched them through surveillance networks, monitored their desperate attempts to recover, and methodically closed every door they tried to open. His new corporation grew quietly but steadily, absorbing vulnerable assets from his former enemies' failed ventures. Each acquisition was legal, logical, and completely untraceable to him. He wasn't just destroying their present. He was using their resources to build his future. The conspirators never realized they were watching their own assets being used against them. They were too busy surviving. Guillermo took increasingly desperate consulting jobs. Sandy moved to progressively smaller apartments. Herman found his reputation so toxic that even startups wouldn't touch him. Patricia's attempts to leverage her former social status met with embarrassing failures. Through it all, Lawrence worked with mechanical precision. Each move was calculated, each consequence measured. He didn't act from emotion, revenge, served cold, required patience and planning. He was building something greater than destruction. A legacy that would prove betrayal never pays. For 6 years, he was a ghost in the machine, an invisible hand of justice. His enemies looked over their shoulders, jumped at shadows, and slowly went mad trying to figure out why everything they touched turned to ash. But Lawrence knew something they didn't. This was just the prelude. The real endgame was still to come. The security cameras caught Patricia's arrival at 9:47 a.m. 6 years had not been kind to her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by off-the-rack wear that tried too hard to look expensive. Her once perfect hair showed streaks of gray, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the lines of bitterness etched into her face. She clutched the hand of a small boy, 5 years old, dark-haired, with Herman's distinctive nose. The child looked around with nervous curiosity as Patricia approached the front desk of the towering glass building that housed Nova Technologies, Lawrence's new empire built from the ashes of his enemies' ambitions. "I need to see Lawrence Sullivan," Patricia announced, her voice carrying the same entitled tone she'd used at the gala 6 years ago. "Tell him his wife is here." The receptionist, already briefed for this moment, replied with practiced neutrality. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's no Lawrence Sullivan here." "Ex-wife," Patricia corrected, fumbling in her purse. "And I know he's here. This building, this company, it's all his. The boy, he needs to meet his father." Security cameras tracked their movement through the lobby. In his office 60 floors above, Lawrence watched the scene unfold on his monitors. DNA test results were already open on his tablet, tests he'd arranged months ago through his surveillance network. The boy's genetic profile was displayed next to Herman's, a 99.9% match. "She's getting desperate," Chris observed from his position by the door. "Trying to claim paternity after 6 years?" Lawrence's lips curved slightly. "Herman knows about the boy. He abandoned them both 3 years ago. My sources confirmed he's been dodging child support through shell companies. The trust you set up for the kid has been covering their basic needs," Chris added, "though Patricia's been neglecting him despite the support." We have documentation of missed doctor's appointments, unexplained absences from school. Lawrence nodded. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd predicted. Patricia's attempt to leverage a non-existent paternity claim would become yet another weapon in his arsenal. "Sir," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mrs. Black is becoming insistent." Lawrence pressed a button, and security footage showed Patricia growing increasingly agitated in the lobby. "You tell Lawrence that Thomas is his son," she demanded, her voice rising. "We were together that last night before he disappeared. He has responsibilities." The boy, Thomas, shrank away from his mother's outburst, displaying a practiced familiarity with her episodes. Lawrence's surveillance had documented dozens of similar scenes. Patricia's public meltdowns, her neglect of the child, her attempts to use him as leverage against both Herman and Lawrence. "Show them up," Lawrence commanded. "It's time to end this particular charade." 10 minutes later, Patricia burst into his office, dragging Thomas behind her. She froze at the sight of Lawrence behind his desk, looking barely a day older than when he'd vanished. Success had preserved him, while failure had ravaged her. "You've been here all along," she whispered. "Right under our noses." "Sit down, Patricia," Lawrence said calmly. "We need to discuss Thomas's future. Specifically, why you've been neglecting the child support payments Herman's sister Ronnie sends for him." Patricia's face went white. "How did you?" "I've been watching. I've watched you waste the support money on failed get-rich-quick schemes. I've documented every missed parent-teacher conference, every skipped medical checkup, every time you left him alone while you chased dead-end leads trying to find my fortune." He turned his tablet around, showing her the DNA results. "Thomas isn't mine, Patricia. But unlike his actual father, I've been ensuring he has food, shelter, and education through the trust one established. The same trust you've been misappropriating. You can't prove." "I can prove everything." Lawrence pressed a button, and screens around the office lit up with surveillance footage, financial records, and medical reports. "The question is, what happens next?" Thomas, forgotten by his mother in her shock, had gravitated toward a corner of the office where a familiar red dress hung in a frame. He stared at it with innocent curiosity while his mother's last desperate gambit crumbled around him. 1 week later, 5 separate town cars arrived at Nova Technologies headquarters. Each carried a passenger who'd received an invitation they couldn't refuse. Herman Black emerged first, his designer suit a cheap knockoff of his former wardrobe. Bankruptcy had left him desperate enough to walk into what he suspected was a trap. Guillermo Sullivan followed, wearing the uniform of the security company where he now worked as a middle manager. 6 years of orchestrated financial disasters had stripped him of everything except his bitter resentment. Sandy stepped out next, clutching a briefcase containing legal papers about her pending criminal charges. Her once confident stride had been replaced by nervous glances over her shoulder. Jared Norton arrived fourth, his immunity deal crumbling under the weight of new evidence. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man watching his carefully constructed lies unravel. Patricia entered last, still reeling from her failed paternity gambit. She'd received custody papers that morning. Herman's sister Ronnie was suing for custody of Thomas, backed by extensive evidence of neglect. The lobby directory listed their destination as Conference Room A, special board meeting. None of them noticed that each guard, each receptionist, each person they passed had been specifically chosen for this day. Lawrence watched their approach on his monitors. Beside him stood his inner circle, each prepared for their role. Mandy, now 24, had grown into a formidable cybersecurity expert. Her tablets displayed years of surveillance data on her mother's activities. Bill, fresh from law school, carried files documenting every aspect of Guillermo's crimes. His uncle's betrayal had shaped his understanding of corporate law. Brooke, promoted to COO, held evidence of Sandy's corporate espionage, every stolen patent, every secret deal, every hidden transaction. Chris maintained his position by the door, ready to present proof of Herman's multiple betrayals. Claudia Martinez, corporate counsel extraordinaire, stood ready with documentation of their collective conspiracy. The conspirators entered the conference room separately, each trying to avoid eye contact with the others. The room's design was deliberate. a long table with high-backed chairs facing a massive screen, currently dark. "Please, be seated," a familiar voice commanded from hidden speakers. The screen lit up, showing Lawrence in his office. But before anyone could react, the conference room's doors opened. Lawrence walked in. The real Lawrence. The screen had been a misdirection, a final reminder of how easily they'd been manipulated. 6 years, he said, taking his place at the head of the table. 6 years of watching you destroy yourselves with your own greed and stupidity. "You bastard." Herman started to rise, but Chris's hand on his shoulder forced him back down. "Interesting choice of words, Herman," Lawrence replied, "especially given how you abandoned your own son." Patricia flinched. Guillermo's security guard uniform suddenly felt too tight. Sandy's fingers trembled on her briefcase. "Today isn't about revenge," Lawrence continued. "It's about justice, about consequences, about truth." He nodded to his team. Mandy stepped forward first, her tablet projecting onto the screen. "Mother, would you like to explain these recordings? The ones showing how you deliberately sabotaged my relationship with Dad." Patricia's face drained of color as her own voice filled the room, carefully orchestrating conflicts, manipulating events, poisoning her children against their father. Bill followed with his presentation. "Uncle Guillermo, the federal authorities are very interested in these transaction records. But they're especially interested in what you did with the money." One by one, they presented their evidence. Brooke exposed Sandy's corporate espionage, including emails proving she'd stolen patents before they were even filed. Chris detailed Herman's betrayals, complete with surveillance footage of meetings with competitors. Claudia presented proof of their collective conspiracy, revealing how each person's actions connected to create a complete picture of betrayal. But it was Lawrence's final revelation that shattered their last hopes. "Your immunity deal, Jared," he said, turning to Norton. "Did you really think I wouldn't find the evidence you held back? The real records of your involvement?" Norton's face went ashen. His immunity deal had been based on full disclosure. The evidence Lawrence now displayed proved he'd lied to federal investigators. The justice Lawrence had orchestrated fell like dominoes, each piece triggering the next with mechanical precision. Herman was the first to break. When faced with Chris's evidence of his corporate fraud, not just the affair with Patricia, but years of selling company secrets, his facade crumbled. "I want to make a deal," he blurted out, earning disgusted looks from his co-conspirators. "The time for deals is over," Lawrence replied. "Federal agents are already processing your involvement in industrial espionage. The evidence has been verified by 3 independent sources." Guillermo tried a different approach. "Brother, please. You lost the right to call me brother when you chose to steal from your own family." Lawrence cut him off. "However, the DA is willing to discuss a plea deal. In exchange for your complete testimony." Guillermo's shoulders slumped. The security guard uniform he wore suddenly felt like a preview of his future prison attire. Within an hour, he'd signed a full confession, detailing every ghost project, every stolen dollar. Sandy's collapse was more spectacular. As Brooke methodically presented evidence of her corporate espionage, her industry contacts were simultaneously receiving detailed documentation of her crimes. By sunset, she'd be blacklisted from every major tech company in the country. "You can't do this," she whispered. But her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I already have," Lawrence replied. "Your new company's assets are being seized as we speak. The patents you stole are being returned to their rightful owner." Jared Norton's immunity deal crumbled under the weight of newly revealed evidence. His attempted betrayal of his co-conspirators had backfired spectacularly. Lawrence had known about his hidden records all along, waiting for the perfect moment to expose them. "The federal prosecutors are particularly interested in the evidence you conveniently forgot to mention," Lawrence informed him. "Immunity deals require full disclosure, Jared. You should have read the fine print." But it was Patricia's fate that proved most fitting. As the others faced their legal consequences, she watched her last claims to Lawrence's fortune evaporate. Every attempt she'd made to access his wealth over the past 6 years was exposed as the desperate grasping it had been. "The boy," she tried one last time. Thomas needs stability," Lawrence interrupted. "Which is why I'm supporting Ronnie's custody petition." Herman's sister has proven to be the only adult in his life who truly cares for his welfare. The resolution moved with swift efficiency. Herman was led away by federal agents, his corporate fraud charges carrying a minimum 10-year sentence. Guillermo signed his plea deal, accepting a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony. Sandy watched helplessly as her industry contacts abandoned her, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. Jared's immunity deal was officially revoked, multiple indictments following within hours. Patricia lost her final appeal for Lawrence's assets, her claims dismissed with prejudice. But Lawrence wasn't finished. As his enemies faced their fates, he turned his attention to the innocent caught in their web. Thomas, Herman's abandoned son, was placed in Ronnie's custody. Lawrence ensured the boy would have everything he needed: education, support, and most importantly, stability. The trust he'd established would guarantee Thomas never suffered for his parents' sins. "Your actions forced me to destroy your world," Lawrence told the assembled conspirators. "But unlike you, I protect the innocent. Thomas will have every opportunity you tried to steal from my own children." As security led them away, Lawrence stood at his office window, watching the sun set over his rebuilt empire. Behind him hung the red dress that had started it all, no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a reminder of justice served. 1 year later, Lawrence sat in that same office, surveying what his revenge had built. The company had grown stronger than ever. Mandy headed the cybersecurity division, her insight shaped by watching her father's strategic brilliance. Bill ran the legal department, his understanding of corporate law deepened by documenting his uncle's crimes. Brooke served as COO, her loyalty rewarded with the position she'd earned. Chris directed global security operations, his protectiveness extending to the entire Sullivan empire. Claudia's position as chief corporate counsel was untouchable, her handling of the conspirators' downfall legendary in legal circles. Meanwhile, the conspirators lived with their consequences. Herman served his time in federal prison, his corporate fraud conviction ensuring he'd never work in business again. His attempts to appeal fell flat, each rejection citing the overwhelming evidence against him. Guillermo worked night shifts as a security guard, his plea deal leaving him just enough freedom to survive, but not enough to thrive. His former wealth and status existed only in his bitter memories. Sandy lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, blacklisted from the corporate world she'd once navigated so confidently. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation met with closed doors and turned backs. Jared faced multiple indictments, his legal troubles mounting as more evidence of his deception came to light. His immunity deal's collapse had triggered a domino effect of legal consequences. Patricia, her society status destroyed, worked as a retail clerk in a mall department store. Her former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Her attempts to rebuild her social standing failed repeatedly, her name now synonymous with betrayal in San Francisco society. The red dress hung in Lawrence's office, framed behind bulletproof glass, a reminder that justice, properly served, required not just vengeance but wisdom. His new wife, Amanda Troy, who had helped expose the conspiracy's financial threads, understood its significance. Their blended family, including Thomas, whom Lawrence mentored from a careful distance, represented his true victory. Revenge, Lawrence had learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about protecting the innocent and ensuring karma found its true targets. As he watched his family and loyal friends celebrating the company's anniversary, he understood that the best revenge wasn't just destroying his enemies. It was building something stronger from the ashes of their betrayal. The power of patient, calculated response to betrayal had proven absolute. Every character's fate felt earned, every resolution complete, every loyalty rewarded. Justice, served cold but served completely, had prevailed. Epilogue. Patricia Black, formerly Sullivan, stared at her reflection in the employee bathroom mirror of Carson's department store. At 52, the careful maintenance of her appearance had become an obsession, a desperate attempt to cling to her former glory. The employee discount barely covered her basic cosmetics, and her monthly paycheck as a sales clerk couldn't sustain even a fraction of her former lifestyle. Her studio apartment, a far cry from the Sullivan mansion, sat above a Chinese restaurant in a forgotten corner of San Francisco. The constant smell of cooking oil served as a daily reminder of her fall. Her wedding rings, both from Lawrence and her brief, disastrous marriage to Herman, had been sold years ago to cover legal fees. Every attempt to rebuild her social standing had failed spectacularly. 3 charity organizations had publicly rejected her volunteer applications. Former friends blocked her calls and social media accounts. Country clubs cited membership restrictions when she attempted to join. Even her mother's bridge club had quietly asked her not to attend their annual fundraiser. Her relationship with Thomas, now 11, existed solely through court-mandated supervised visits twice a month. Ronnie, Herman's sister, had won full custody 5 years ago, backed by Lawrence's meticulous documentation of Patricia's neglect. The trust Lawrence had established ensured Thomas attended the best schools and had every opportunities Patricia could no longer pretend to provide. Herman Black's fate proved equally fitting. Federal prison Camp Montgomery had stripped away his arrogance along with his freedom. His 7-year sentence, reduced from 10 for cooperation, offered ample time to reflect on his choices. His cellmate, ironically, was a former hedge fund manager who'd lost everything to one of Lawrence's market corrections. The consequences of their betrayal continued to unfold. Patricia's attempts to write a tell-all book were shut down by ironclad NDAs. Herman's appeals were rejected with increasing finality. Their joint assets had been seized and liquidated. Their reputations were so thoroughly destroyed that even their failures made no news. Lawrence's new headquarters dominated the San Francisco skyline, a testament to patient revenge and calculated reconstruction. The Nova Technologies logo gleamed against the morning sun, while inside, the fruits of loyalty flourished. Mandy Sullivan, now strategic director of cybersecurity, had transformed her father's security protocols into an industry standard. Her department's innovations, born from watching Lawrence's methodical dismantling of his enemies, regularly set new benchmarks in digital protection. At 29, industry publications already called her the next generation of security evolution. Bill Sullivan's legal department had become legendary for its precision. His understanding of corporate law, shaped by documenting his uncle's downfall, made him uniquely qualified to protect the company's interests. His recent marriage to the daughter of a Supreme Court justice had added another layer of influence to the Sullivan legacy. Brooks' promotion to COO proved Lawrence's eye for talent. Her management style, learned from years of watching him operate, combined efficiency with strategic insight. The board's unanimous support of her leadership reflected the company's strongest quarter in history. Chris expanded global security into an independent subsidiary, providing specialized services to select clients. His loyalty to Lawrence had been rewarded with partial ownership of the new venture, though he still personally oversaw the Sullivan family's security. Claudia Martinez's position as chief corporate counsel came with a corner office and a view of the Bay. Her handling of the conspirators' downfall had become a case study at leading law schools, though the full details remained sealed. Lawrence's marriage to Amanda Troy brought more than personal happiness. It united 2 powerful families with complementary strengths. Her financial expertise had helped trace the conspiracy's money trails, and her understanding of loss, having lost her first husband to the conspirators' machinations, gave her unique insight into Lawrence's motivations. Their blended family thrived. Amanda's teenage daughters excelled under Mandy's mentorship. Thomas, though not officially part of the family, received carefully structured guidance. The Sullivan name once again represented integrity and innovation. Their regular family dinners became a symbol of victory over betrayal. The company's success exceeded even Lawrence's calculations. Nova Technologies absorbed key markets from competitors, strategic acquisitions strengthened their global position, innovation patents secured their technological lead, stock values tripled under the new leadership. Lawrence maintained discreet surveillance on his former enemies, not from fear or obsession, but as a matter of principle. Their continuing struggles served as data points in his understanding of justice. Patricia's attempts at redemption, failed interviews for better positions, rejected applications for loans, unsuccessful efforts to contact Thomas outside approved visits, declined submissions to society magazines about her sigh. Herman's prison existence, declined requests for parole, failed attempts to publish business insights, rejected appeals for sentence reduction, growing isolation as former contacts abandoned him. The red dress, still framed in Lawrence's office, had acquired almost mythical status among employees. New hires learned quickly not to ask about it directly, but its story, carefully curated versions of it, circulated as a warning about betrayal and a testament to loyalty. Lawrence's revenge hadn't just destroyed his enemies. It had built something greater, a corporate culture that valued loyalty above all, a family strengthened by overcoming betrayal, a legacy secured for generations, a reputation for patient, absolute justice. Thomas, unaware of his full connection to events, was thriving under Ronnie's care. The trust Lawrence established ensured he would have every opportunity to build his own legacy, untainted by his parents' choices. In the end, Lawrence's patient vengeance had transformed betrayal into foundation stones for a stronger future. The conspirators' fate served as a perpetual reminder. Karma comes not as swift lightning, but as the inevitable tide, rising slowly but absolutely, drowning those who mistake patience for weakness. The Sullivan name endured, stronger than ever. While those who had tried to destroy it lived on as cautionary tales, their falls as complete as their betrayal had been profound. Lawrence kept only one photo from his previous marriage, not for sentiment, but for perspective. It showed Patricia in the red dress at the gala, celebrating what she thought was her triumph. Beside it, quarterly reports showed Nova Technologies' continuing dominance, each success another stone in the edifice built from his enemy's destruction. Perfect revenge, Lawrence had learned, wasn't just about destroying enemies. It was about using their destruction to build something they could never taint, never touch, and never comprehend. A legacy of justice served cold, complete, and without regret.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.
Doug had been my closest friend for as long as I could remember. We met back in high school, where he stood out as the brightest student in our class, while I, Stan, hovered around the top rankings. Though he took an unconventional route, leaving college after just a year, Doug's sharp mind and talent for finance never ceased to amaze me. By our late 20s, Doug had already amassed a fortune, turning a modest inheritance into a significant wealth through diligent self-study and smart investments. Unlike others with similar fortunes, he never showed off. Instead, he used his resources to create a luxurious but inviting home where friends, including my wife Heather and me, could gather. Heather, my vibrant partner of 4 years, had a way of bringing light to any room she entered. From the moment we met, I was drawn to her quick wit and infectious laugh, though our life together had its occasional challenges. I never doubted that those years were some of my happiest. That evening, Doug was hosting his big New Year's Eve party, an event that had become an annual tradition. I looked forward to spending the night in a lively atmosphere, reconnecting with old friends, and most of all, sharing moments of joy and renewal with Heather by my side. I walked up to Doug's front door and rang the bell, feeling a rush of excitement as I pulled Heather close for a quick kiss. Her smile, her warmth, these were moments I held dear. The sound of music and the hum of voices hinted at the size of the crowd inside. Doug's parties were always big, but tonight's turnout seemed even grander. When the door finally opened, there he stood, his face breaking into a wide grin as he waved us in. The number of cars outside had been a clue, but seeing the sea of guests confirmed it. Tonight was going to be unforgettable. Just as I was about to ring the bell again, Doug opened the door and greeted us loudly, welcoming us inside. I had guessed from the number of parked cars that the party would be huge, but I was still surprised by the crowd in his home. Doug gave Heather a warm hug and a light kiss on the cheek before guiding her in. He then shook my hand and stepped aside so I could enter. A maid took our coats and disappeared with them. Doug walked with us, saying, "It's so great to see you both. I don't love having parties this big, but I feel obligated to invite everyone. Business or social ties bind me to most guests, except for a few good friends like you two. Clarissa is around here somewhere, probably dodging wandering hands as usual." The night continued. Heather and I danced, ate, and drank more than we should have. We didn't mind because we knew we had a room upstairs for when we needed it. We were among the few invited to stay the night, so we didn't have to worry about driving or finding a cab or having one of us stay sober. I worked in the investment field, and I was one of the top brokers in my office and ranked in the top quarter of brokers company-wide. So I was familiar with many guests in the room. I agreed with Doug's sentiments. Quite a few were unpleasant characters. Heather, being as beautiful as she was, had to fend off attention, much like Doug's Clarissa. Throughout the night, I used the time to network, greeting clients and reaching out to potential new ones. I kept an eye on Heather as the evening wore on. Though I completely trusted her, I couldn't help feeling a bit jealous. I made a point to step in when I saw men trying to charm her a bit too much. Each time I did, Heather rewarded me with a smile and a soft kiss, whispering, "Thank you," or "Thanks for saving me, honey." This evening was no different. I approached whenever I saw her trying to escape unwanted attention, and she would thank me with a smile, a hug, or a kiss on the cheek. We'd talk for a bit, dance or drink together, and then go our separate ways. As the night wore on and guests began to leave, only those staying until midnight remained. I noticed a particular man who seemed to be following Heather, his eyes never leaving her. He was fixated, clearly smitten, and seized every chance to stay close. At first, Heather ignored him or walked away, but as the night went on, she started lingering near him, even smiling or laughing at his comments. Occasionally, she would touch his forearm lightly. This wasn't typical of Heather. She never flirted that long with any man, especially a stranger. Doug caught me watching them just before midnight and came over. "That's Jonathan Douglas with Heather. He's a real idiot, a top-tier ladies' man. I didn't even invite him. One of the women I invited brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood next to me, scanning the room carefully. A curious expression crossed his face. "Actually, it seems like Douglas's date already left tonight." She watched him follow Heather around for a bit, then I saw them having a pretty heated conversation. I haven't seen her since. "He's bad news, Stan, trouble with a capital T. He's married, but they're practically living apart. He preys on married women or anyone he thinks he can take advantage of. Strangely enough, he's already wealthy. Watch out for him. He could charm a nun and make her believe it was her idea and she's in love with him." For the third time that night, I walked over to separate Heather and Jonathan. He shot me a glare like he had before when I interrupted. I took Heather aside with a dismissive comment as we walked away. This time, Heather didn't thank me. She gave me a frustrated look and said, "Stan, what's wrong with you tonight? You could have just told me. I was enjoying talking to Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to pull me away? He's not like the usual creeps you save me from. He's really interesting with great stories. He's running for mayor and was sharing what it's like dealing with people during his campaign. When he found out I worked in public information and advertising, he started asking for advice on reaching voters. I think he might even offer me a job. Honey, I really need to stay in touch with him. Just think of what it could mean if I landed a role in his administration." "I don't care, Heather. I don't trust him, and I don't like him being near you. Doug says he's trouble, and I've heard bad things about him too. I want you to stay safe. From what I hear, the kind of job he's suggesting comes with strings attached." Heather looked at me, anger flashing across her face. I worried I'd gone too far, but then she smiled. Leaning in, she kissed my cheek and said, "Oh, that's sweet. I think you're actually jealous. But don't worry, sweetie, you're all mine." Later, as we mingled, I realized she had said I was all hers, not that she was all mine. That thought made me pause, wondering if I'd said too much or if she was hinting at something deeper. 3 months later, that night replayed vividly in my mind. The past 2 months had been turbulent at home. Not long after the party, Heather started coming home late from meetings or visits with her parents. When I asked, she'd become defensive or angry, saying she lost track of time or needed to finish a project. She also started volunteering at the local Republican Party, which took up more of her evening. Heather was known for her exceptional management skills and quickly became the volunteer office manager at the campaign headquarters, helping with informational strategies. From what I gathered, she brought order and became a popular volunteer, much like a husband unaware he's being deceived. With her increased absences, I noticed our closeness suffered. Rejections became more frequent. She always had reasons. She was tired, it was too late, or we were short on time, but it was clear. One day I confided in Doug about my marriage struggles. He gave me a worried look and finally said, "Stan, I'm concerned. I might be part of why your marriage has been strained recently. I heard Jonathan found another married woman. Word is he met her at a New Year's Eve party, and we both know where he was that night and who he spent time with. The rumor says she's also volunteering on his mayoral campaign." A wave of dizziness hit me, and I felt my breath catch. Doug noticed and kept talking. "Stan, what's wrong? You just went pale. I looked at Doug and said, "Heather started volunteering at the Republican Party office about an hour after work. On Saturdays, she always comes home late and refuses to share what she's been doing. Whenever I bring it up, she becomes defensive and angry. Lately, she even gets mad when I approach her in the evenings." Doug leaned back in his chair, pressing his lips together for a moment before saying, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on. And let's just say, if he's abusing my hospitality by getting involved with my best friend's wife, there will be consequences. I'd be furious if he pursued any married woman at one of my parties, but taking advantage of my hospitality by targeting your wife is unforgivable. I should have made him leave when his date left, but I was too focused on being a good host. If I've caused you trouble, my friend, I'll do everything I can to make it right. Let me tell you more about Doug. He's my best friend, someone I'd trust with my life, someone I'd even trust around my wife. He would never intentionally hurt me, and we were closer than brothers. Doug is exceptionally intelligent, probably the smartest person I've ever met. We were in the same high school class. He was the valedictorian, while I barely made it into the top 10 out of 223 students. He only attended 1 year of college before deciding it was a waste of time. Despite skipping classes and never studying, he still maintained a 4.0 GPA. Eventually, he took a few finance courses and then taught himself everything he needed to know about investing in finance. Doug's reason for learning business and finance was due to an inheritance of just over $70,000 from his grandparents during his freshman year. Unlike most young people, he didn't waste the money. He upgraded to a better used pickup truck and invested the rest in the stock market. He bought his first 2 stocks based on a broker's advice. They didn't perform well, and only the broker and the firm profited. This experience frustrated Doug, so he began to study the market. He watched CNBC, read extensively, and conducted research. He opened an account at a discount brokerage, moved all his savings there, and began investing on his own. From his first independent trade, Doug started making money, far more than he did with the so-called experts. It helped that he began during the late 1980s tech boom and dot-com era. He rode the waves of volatile stocks, and although not every investment was profitable, he significantly grew his capital. He had the foresight to switch to safer stocks when things got rough, benefiting from the market's upward trends. Doug bought Berkshire Hathaway at just over $17,000 per share and sold it 3 years later at $72,357 per share. By then, he was a multimillionaire, investing with others in venture capital and real estate. I graduated college and worked as a salesman for a restaurant chain for 4 years. I didn't enjoy the travel and wanted to be serious with Heather, so I transitioned into becoming a stockbroker. Doug entrusted me with managing a portion of his wealth when I started, likely to support a friend, which made me feel guilty. I knew he didn't need my advice, but it felt charitable. Doug convinced me he needed me, citing 2 reasons. He wanted to spread his investments across multiple brokerages for security, and believed having someone inside the industry might uncover valuable information before he did. While we never considered anything close to insider trading, I occasionally found useful insights for him. We both thrived. Doug referred many friends and acquaintances who wanted full-service brokerage help, which boosted my income through deals I made. Doug didn't work outside his home. He spent 8 to 10 hours daily studying stocks and trading, but only for himself. He led an extravagant life and tried to include Heather and me in his social circle. We attended numerous charity events with him, often at his expense. Sometimes I covered the bills with my expense account as a broker. We joined him at political events, mingling with influential people in our community. And of course, we attended every party Doug hosted at his house. Friday night after my talk with Doug, we went to a $500 a plate political rally with him and his companion. Once again, Doug treated Heather and me to the meal. This time, Heather seemed even more hesitant to join us than usual. Unfortunately, I insisted she come, and I regret that decision to this day. I suppose the disaster our marriage was heading toward would have happened once Doug's investigators reported back on Heather. But at least I would have stayed in the dark a bit longer. That dinner marked the beginning of the end. When we arrived, we realized we were at an event where the incumbent state Senate candidate was speaking to support other state and local candidates. The money for the tickets went to the state Republican Party, with some funds directed to local campaigns. What I didn't know was that the special guest would be a mayoral candidate for our city, Jonathan Douglas. When we entered, I saw Jonathan at the front of the room, smiling and talking with dignitaries. Heather pulled away slightly, and I turned to see her staring at Jonathan, her face glowing like someone in love. That's when I suspected I had lost her. "What?" I asked. Heather flinched, giving me a weak smile. "I'm sorry, honey. I didn't know this was his event." She looked so guilty that I questioned if she was being truthful, but said nothing. She must have known Jonathan would be there, given her part-time work at campaign headquarters. Now I understood her reluctance to come. I glanced at Doug, who had been observing us. He turned to look at Jonathan, then smiled and guided Heather to a chair, helping her sit down before seating Clarissa to his left. As I passed Doug, he said, "I'm sorry, Stan. I didn't know he'd be part of this when I invited you. I saw her reaction. I hope I'm wrong. But I have a meeting set for Monday with someone I want you to meet. Can we do lunch at 11:30? Heather finished her meal and excused herself to the restroom. I noticed Jonathan slipping out through another door. I thought for a moment, then stood to follow. Doug grabbed my shoulder. "No, Stan, let it go. If it's true, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday, please." Later that night, I lost track of Heather again. After returning from the restroom, I went searching and found myself backstage. I heard low voices and soft moans. One of them was unmistakably Heather's. Anger surged as I moved toward the sounds, tripping over a rope and making noise. Heather's voice broke the silence. "Oh, someone's coming. I need to go." Jonathan responded quickly, his tone urgent. "Honey, if we get caught now, it'll be bad for both of us. I'll see you at the office. I love you." A brief kiss followed, then the sound of hurried footsteps fading away. I rushed after them but was too late to confirm what I suspected, that it was Heather and Jonathan. As I turned back, I ran into Doug, who looked furious. He grabbed my arm, forcing me to stop and face him. "Stan, I warned you to stay out of this," Doug snapped. "My team needs time to gather evidence before you do something reckless. If she's cheating, and I believe she is, we need proof so you can handle this smartly and come out ahead in a divorce if that's what you choose. The way you're going, you'll only hurt yourself in court." After calming me a bit, Doug said, "I saw them heading down another hallway. They stopped at a door and she looked around for you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought you were searching for them. Now he's suspicious, and it'll be harder for you to expose him." When Doug and I returned to the table, we put on a show, making sure Heather and the others noticed us laughing and sharing a pocket flask. Heather's eyes flicked to me as I sat beside her and asked, "Where have you two been?" Clarissa wrapped her arms around Doug, smiling mischievously. "Next time I catch you two sneaking out for a drink, I'm either joining or turning you in. Now, pass that flask." We exchanged glances as Heather visibly relaxed. She turned to Clarissa, curiosity in her voice. "Is that what they were doing? I was wondering where they went when I couldn't find them." Clarissa laughed, adding, "Oh yes, I tried to catch them to claim my share before they got back, but they were too quick for me." Later, during the dance, I had my turn with Clarissa. She leaned in close, and when I tried to glance around the room, she held me steady, keeping my attention on her. She kissed my cheek lightly and whispered, "No, Stan, don't look over there. Just dance with me, and try to enjoy tonight. I know what you're going through, and it's only going to get worse. Just remember, Doug and I are here for you, and always." I relaxed a bit and returned her kiss gently. "Thanks for helping keep things light. I nearly lost my cool, and Doug says that would be a huge mistake. I want to tear that idiot apart so badly, I can't stand it." The following days and weekend were difficult. I cycled between fear and anger. Deep down, I realized Heather had already emotionally distanced herself from me, and it was only a matter of time before she left physically. We hadn't been a happy couple for weeks. I started pulling back emotionally, even though I didn't have concrete proof she was cheating. If she wasn't, then something else was wrong, because we weren't the same loving couple we used to be. Finally, the day of my meeting with Doug and his friend arrived. I suspected this friend would be a private investigator. Anxiety churned in my stomach, and I felt sick. My anger simmered, and I knew they could both see it. I was terrified of what I might find out, but also desperate to know the truth. Doug stood to greet me as I approached, shook my hand, and hugged me. After the greetings, he introduced me to Simon Hobbs, an investigator. We sat for a moment, scanning the menu before placing our orders. Once the waitress left, Doug said, "Let's get the unpleasant part over with, shall we?" He glanced at Simon and then at me. Simon opened his briefcase and took out a large envelope, handing it to me. "We've been monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas at Doug's request. Surveillance lasted 20 days, ending last Saturday night. In that time, we discovered they had lunch together daily, except Sundays when she stayed home. These lunches were held at various upscale hotels, followed by trips to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 separate occasions, we entered the room posing as room service staff. Each time, the bed was clearly used. Photos and documentation are in the report. We also made audio recordings by placing a microphone under the door. They engaged in intimate activities during each hotel visit." Simon continued. "We also noted inappropriate interactions at or after the campaign office on multiple occasions. We photographed them together 3 times at the office and once at a local bar event with friends and supporters. The most significant discovery was how Mr. Douglas used your wife to gain support from the Municipal Employees Union. They met with Union President Stephen Negrano at a gentleman's club. He seemed very taken with your wife, and we captured photos of her sitting on his lap." Simon paused before adding, "My team managed to record this interaction. Listen to this segment. Then we'll discuss it further." He placed a small laptop on the table and played the audio. "You'll receive this DVD with your report, but I wanted to talk this over before we end today. My operative was quite confident this would interest your attorney." Doug and I leaned in, watching and listening closely. In the footage, Heather sat between Jonathan and Stephen, with both men leaning in to speak to her, Jonathan's hands roaming. Heather could be heard saying, "Stop that." But Jonathan replied, "Heather, you know you like this. Just relax and go with it. It's not as if anyone will notice here." Jonathan leaned in and kissed her while Stephen said, "Jonathan, you know what's needed for the union's support. I want a weekend with this lady. If I get that, the union will back your campaign." Heather stiffened and tried to stand, whispering sharply, "No, that's not happening. Let go of me." Stephen looked at Jonathan, raising an eyebrow. Jonathan swallowed and leaned into Heather, saying, "We really need this, honey. Just go along and help me out. It's for our future. And it's not like you haven't done this before. Just tell your husband you have a work meeting this weekend." On the video, Heather looked shocked, resisted briefly, and then visibly relaxed. We saw the undeniable proof of her betrayal. Around this time, the club manager approached their table, glancing nervously at Heather and the men beside her. He stuttered as he spoke. "Mr. Negrano, I've done a lot for you, but I've been warned that you and the others have become too noticeable. Lieutenant Jones said the chief is sending detectives here to crack down on scenes like this. If we're caught, I'll be jailed. Could you please move this to a back room or the hotel? This business is my livelihood." Stephen laughed and turned to the large man on the other side of the table. "Hey, Ralph, give Joe a couple $1,000 for his trouble. The lady and I are heading to the DoubleTree for the weekend. Get it set up like a union leadership meeting, the usual way." I felt a surge of anger and started to rise. That lying woman. She told me she had an emergency work project and was flying to San Francisco last weekend. Doug and Simon quickly pulled me back into my seat. Simon said, "Hold on, sir. Let me fast forward to show you one more segment, and then you can read the full report. We need to talk about some of this, but I thought you'd want to see the DVD first." My operative stopped recording at the club and called for backup. They reached the DoubleTree Hotel ahead of the group. When the men checked in, my operatives, dressed in hotel uniforms, followed them. After the room was inspected, my team entered and set up flowers, pillows, and other items. Simon smiled as he explained. The older man even sent his assistant for fresh flowers and champagne to give them an excuse to linger in the room. We managed to install cameras and microphones in the main room and both bedrooms. By the time your wife and Stanley returned, they were drunk. The footage captured everything. Simon resumed the DVD on his laptop. Heather and Stanley entered the suite and shut the door, heading to the bedroom where they engaged in intimate activities. Simon turned off the video and looked at me. "Your wife stayed in that room until checkout on Monday. During that time, she was involved with several senior union officials, including Stephen. Late Saturday night, Jonathan joined them, and he, the director, and Stephen spent most of the night with her. We have footage of them plotting the misuse of union funds to back Jonathan's campaign, and pictures of Senator Nussbaum and 2 judges joining in with Heather and Jonathan. Records indicate that he traded her favors for endorsements." The investigator paused before continuing. "During your attempt to confront your wife and Douglas at the election dinner, They were about to engage in inappropriate behavior backstage when she heard you and stopped him. They ran when they realized you were close. We have images from that incident, and it would have been better if you hadn't intervened. Photos of that situation would have been highly damaging. At least you didn't get caught or create a scene that could have hurt your case. We've compiled the entire report and can share it with your attorney if needed. Our investigation fees cover any necessary court testimony. I'd suggest continued surveillance for potential criminal charges. Although this is typically police work, presenting documented misuse of campaign funds and conspiracy to the authorities and the FBI will make them take it seriously. Plus, if you file for divorce and your wife ends up prosecuted, you'll be in a better position for a favorable settlement. Despite expecting this, I was stunned and distressed. The level of betrayal Heather demonstrated during surveillance was staggering. The documents revealed she believed she was in love with Jonathan and was planning her departure from me. She spoke excitedly about the role she was promised in his administration if he won the mayoral race. What shocked me most was her willingness to spend the weekend at the DoubleTree and the extent of what she did for Jonathan and his associates. I always knew Heather was ambitious and admired by influential people, but I couldn't believe she'd go to such lengths to get what she wanted. I felt almost physically sick. I hadn't eaten much, and I noticed Doug hadn't either. After the investigator left, we each had a few drinks. We sat in silence for a while, deep in thought, until Doug spoke. "Stan, I'm sorry for wrecking your marriage. I take full responsibility for your troubles and will do my best to make it up to you. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'll help in any way I can. I'll find you a good lawyer if... No, not just for the divorce. I'll give you whatever support you need until you're back to how you were before, as much as possible." I pushed back from the table and looked at Doug, "Then start finding a lawyer." I was almost ready to give her an ultimatum, either stop this behavior or we're getting a divorce, even before I knew for sure she was cheating. Now, there's no way I'm letting her walk away unscathed. I can't believe she did those things. I wonder when she changed or if I ever really knew her at all. As for everything else, I continued, Heather's cheating isn't your fault, and you don't owe me anything for it. On Thursday, Doug called and said, "Stan, I found a top-notch lawyer for you. She has a real passion for taking down cheaters and always sides with the innocent in divorce cases. She can't stand public figures and businessmen who misuse their power to cheat. If you play this right, you can not only leave Heather and keep most of your assets, but also take Jonathan down." Doug gave me her name and number, and I called that afternoon to set up a consultation. When I mentioned my name, the assistant said they'd been expecting my call and offered an appointment for 9 a.m. the next morning. I accepted and was given a list of items to bring and information to prepare. When I arrived, I was promptly shown into the office. My new attorney, Sally, made a strong impression, and we quickly got into a comfortable discussion about my goals for the divorce. I told her, "I want to come out of this marriage with everything I have. I know that's unlikely, but that's my goal. And I want to sue the man who stole my wife for everything possible. I want him to lose the election and end up with nothing." Sally leaned back in her chair, rocking slightly as she considered the situation. A small smile crossed her lips. "Do you really want this? Or do you want to financially ruin him, destroy his reputation, and send him to prison? If we handle this strategically, we could probably get him jail time. I've read part of the investigator's report, and it's very compelling. I'm sorry for what you're going through, but the evidence is strong enough to take down most of the major players involved in this mess. Plus, I'm obligated to share the report with the authorities since federal laws were violated. If we notify them first and then file for divorce, it'll hit him harder. But if you file for divorce first, he'll have time to escape or delay the fallout." I clenched my fists, my voice steady with anger. "I don't care how it's done, as long as it hurts him and everyone else involved. Heather is absolutely guilty. There's no doubt about it. From what I saw, he pursued her relentlessly until she finally gave in. She always wore her wedding ring, so he knew she was married. I even heard tapes where they mocked me and talked about their plans for when she would leave me." Sally and I went over all the details, and I made my decision. I instructed her to prepare and file the divorce papers right away. We agreed that the investigator's report should be handed over to the FBI to initiate an investigation into campaign finance violations and misuse of union and city funds. Sally advised me to accompany the bailiff when Heather was served and when Mr. Douglas was warned of the impending lawsuit. "If he acts like most powerful people, he'll either threaten you, try to have you fired, or threaten a countersuit," she said. "Stand firm, and he may try to settle with you in secret. If he does, depending on where the funds come from, we could pursue additional campaign law charges. Politicians often try to use campaign funds to cover things up, so be ready for that possibility. Sally reached into her desk and handed me a small microphone and recorder. She said, "I want you to carry this with you at all times and keep it on. Hide the microphone in your hair and keep the recorder in your car. The transmitter's range is about half a mile. If your car is out of range, the microphone can record up to 6 hours. Once you're within range, the recordings will automatically download. If you give me your keys, I'll have someone install the recorder in your car while we finish up here. Also, I suggest either rehiring your private investigator or letting me find one to continue monitoring your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've learned that Mrs. Malone isn't the first married woman he's pursued, and when caught, he has tried illegal ways to cover it up. If we capture their plans on tape this time, we can really corner both him and your wife." I smiled and said, "The detective suggested the same thing. I'm keeping him on standby." On Thursday morning, Sally called me. "Mr. Malone, we're ready to file the divorce papers and serve them to your wife. Do you still want to attend and make your remarks?" "Oh, absolutely," I replied. "I might even get some satisfaction out of it." I was also thinking, shouldn't we serve her at campaign headquarters this Friday night? There was a pause before Sally responded, "No, Stan, I don't think that's a good idea. If you serve her there and make your statements, everyone at the campaign will know about it almost instantly. It'll be in the newspapers the next day, and Mr. Douglas, feeling cornered and publicly humiliated, won't have any incentive to retaliate or try to make a deal. I suggest serving her when she's alone or just with him." I nodded, understanding her point. "I see what you mean. Why don't we follow them and see if they go out alone tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't come home until almost midnight on Fridays. According to the investigator's report, they often spend Friday nights at a hotel, the same one they visit during the day. Could we serve them there and maybe catch them in the act?" Sally agreed, and we planned for the bailiff and me to interrupt their meeting at the hotel room Friday night. When I entered my office, 2 men in suits were waiting for me. They introduced themselves and said they wanted to discuss managing some funds for their widowed mother. I invited them in, but after I closed the door, they showed me their FBI badges. They wanted to talk about my interest in Jonathan, as they were building a case based on the material my lawyer had provided. When they learned I planned to join the bailiff and record the event, they asked if I would wear one of their recording devices. This made me uneasy, as I worried it might affect my chances of securing a financial settlement from Jonathan. However, I couldn't find a good reason to refuse, so I agreed to wear their wire. That night, we followed the unsuspecting couple from campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left at 7 p.m. and were in the room by 7:30. Our group was so large it felt like a convoy, and I worried they might notice. After they checked into the hotel, we waited nearly an hour. I had brought my camera to document the moment, even though I'm not one for home videos. This was an exception. Just as we prepared to knock on the door, we got an unexpected break. The elevator opened and a waiter stepped out with a cart. He approached the room and looked at us curiously. I smiled, pointed to the door, and said, "Go on in. We didn't mean to interrupt Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll be right behind you." The waiter smiled back. "No problem," he said. He knocked, announced room service, and when Jonathan opened the door, he entered. The process server and I waited until the waiter came out. When he did, I moved to keep the door from closing. The process server and I slipped inside quietly. We stood near the door, hidden from view, and waited for Jonathan and Heather to begin their meal before stepping into full view. When we stepped into the room, I was slightly ahead of the others. The scene in front of me left me shocked, horrified, and heartbroken. Even though I had seen the investigator's report, witnessing it firsthand was different. Both of them looked euphoric. Finally, I nodded to the process server who stepped into the room. The process server stepped forward and asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather gasped, and Jonathan's face contorted with anger as he stood abruptly. "Yes, you idiot, I am. Now get out of my hotel room. How did you even get in here?" "Sir, the room service waiter let us in as he left. Didn't you hear us ask if we could come in? I thought you had invited us." The process server moved closer and handed Heather the divorce papers. "You have been served," he said firmly. I stepped further into the room, and Heather's eyes widened as she noticed me for the first time. "Stan, damn you, what are you doing here? And what is this divorce? If you don't stop this madness, you'll end up with nothing. I'll take it all." "No, Heather, you won't," I said coldly. "If you know what's good for you, you'll sign the papers and accept the deal I offered. Once I'm through with you, I'm going after him. I'm going to sue Jonathan and his campaign for mental anguish and alienation of affection. Lucky for me, We live in a state that still allows those kinds of lawsuits. And as a bonus, this will put a dent in his election campaign. You're about to lose everything." Heather didn't come home that night, and I heard nothing from her until the following Wednesday. That morning, my office phone rang, and her voice came through the line, cold and direct. "Jonathan and I want to meet to discuss this situation. We've booked a meeting room at the DoubleTree Hotel for tonight. We want to resolve this and move forward. Be there at 7. There was no invitation, just an expectation. I called Sally to inform her of the call and then reached out to my FBI contact. Both Sally and the FBI advised me to attend. Sally assured me she would come along, and the FBI said they'd have support nearby if needed. When I arrived at the hotel, the receptionist directed me to a small meeting room down the hall. A large man stood guard at the entrance, blocking my way as I approached. "There's a private meeting in progress, sir," he said firmly. "I'm Stan Malone, and I'm expected," I replied. He scrutinized my ID before giving a nod. Turning to the door, he knocked twice. The door creaked open just enough for him to speak through the gap. "Mr. Malone is here, sir," he announced. I couldn't hear the response, but the door closed. The guard then said, "I need to search you. Please empty your pockets into the tray." After complying, I became annoyed and demanded an explanation for the search. The guard smirked and said, "Political figures have enemies, sir, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want any risks." I suspected they were looking for recording devices but didn't comment. My hair was long enough to hide the small transmitters glued to my scalp. After the search, it took about 5 minutes before the door opened, allowing me to enter. Heather was sitting at the table looking at me with guilt written all over her flushed face. Anger bubbled up in me as I processed what she had likely done. Jonathan sat there smirking, his eyes gleaming, clearly relishing the fact that he had just been with my wife. The meeting played out just as Sally and I expected. Jonathan threatened me, first with losing my job, and then with physical damage if I didn't offer Heather a better settlement and drop my plans for lawsuits against him and his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Listen, mister, I know you and your friends might manage to hurt or even eliminate me, but that won't save you. I've taken every precaution and prepared multiple packages to be mailed out. If anything happens to me or my family, even if I'm in an accident, those packages will be sent. You and I both know that not all media can be controlled. Some of it will get published, especially if I'm seriously hurt or liquidated. You will go down." I saw anger flash across Jonathan's face and noticed him tense. Something I had learned over the years meant Heather was furious. I smiled and continued speaking. "I know what you just did before I arrived, and I have pictures of you doing it multiple times. I even have evidence of your meeting last week at the DoubleTree with union leaders and senior city officials. Do you really think they'll thank you for dragging them into this? If anything happens to me, those documents will expose them, my wife and you. We both know many of them have dangerous connections." Heather glared at me while Jonathan looked a bit unsettled. He tried to maintain his composure and said, "You heard me. Drop your threats and handle this quietly or else. Now get out. I'm done talking." I stood up, locking eyes with Jonathan until he began to look uneasy. I could tell he felt cornered. I chuckled and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You know, Jonathan, I might reconsider if I received fair compensation in the divorce. And if the people in this town elect you, they deserve what they get." I headed straight home and found my private investigator already there with an FBI agent. They had removed their recording devices and secured them. The investigator said, "We captured everything, including Jonathan's conversation with your wife and his associates after you left. He's got someone tailing you now, tasked with watching and reporting anything suspicious. You're making him nervous." 3 days later, I made sure Jonathan's tail was nearby when I called my lawyer. We discussed the divorce, and as we wrapped up, I said, "Sally, I'm done waiting. I've told both Heather and Jonathan what I need to walk away, and they're stalling. Prepare the paperwork and file a lawsuit against Jonathan. Let's go for $10 million. That should catch his attention and make headlines." I smirked as I watched Jonathan's henchman retreat and make a frantic phone call, gesturing wildly. Without waiting for the outcome, I got in my car and drove home. That night, just as I was settling in, hunger gnawing at me since I hadn't eaten dinner, my phone rang. Jonathan's voice came through the line, careful not to mention that his man had overheard my conversation with Sally. "Listen, Malone," Jonathan began. "Heather and I talked, and we've decided to meet some of your demands. She'll sign the divorce papers as is, taking only her personal belongings and her pension. I'm prepared to offer an out-of-court settlement if you ensure this stays quiet." "Jonathan, all I can promise is that I won't be the one to leak anything," I replied. "But I can't guarantee someone else won't. There are likely hundreds of people who already know about your involvement with my wife. Jonathan's voice tightened. Fine. Here's the deal. You sign a non-disclosure agreement and I'll transfer $1 million into your account. No questions asked. Heather will file the divorce papers and agree to your terms. I chuckled. That's a small offer, Jonathan. My lawyer just filed a $10 million personal injury suit. I might not get the full amount, but you'll need to offer more than $1 million for me to consider dropping it. Besides, I could make even more from book and movie deals. There was a pause before Jonathan responded, frustration seeping through. All right. I might be able to go higher, but not by much. How about $1.7 million? That's the most I can transfer without drawing attention. I'll find a way to mask it as campaign expenses, but that's my best offer. Deal, I said. But I won't tell my lawyer to pause any actions until the money is in my account. Here's the number for my offshore account in the Caymans. What Jonathan didn't know was that I had set up the account in his name with his mailing address. I hoped federal investigators would trace the money from his campaign to the account. I planned to transfer the money as soon as it hit, so it couldn't be retrieved. Later that evening, my doorbell rang. The same man who guarded the door at my meeting with Jonathan and Heather stood there, holding a clipboard with a one-page legal document. Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for you to sign, he said. I read it, then looked at him. It looks fine, but I need to review it with my lawyer before signing. I really shouldn't leave without it, he replied. I sighed and closed the door in his face. I went to my office and called Sally, explaining the situation. She agreed to come over and review the document. It took her nearly an hour to arrive, but after reading it, she smiled and advised me to sign. 3 days later, I confirmed that the account balance in the Cayman Islands was $1,700,000. That same day, my attorney called to inform me that Heather had signed and returned the divorce agreement, which had been filed with the court. With the divorce being uncontested, it was expected to be finalized within 30 days. I had already transferred the money from the Cayman account in case Jonathan tried to reclaim it. I moved it through multiple global transactions before depositing it in another Cayman account under a different alias. I kept working through this difficult period, but my performance suffered. My commissions dropped to almost half of what they usually were, not just due to the economy, but also because I frequently relied on coworkers to handle my clients' transactions, splitting the commissions. After the divorce was finalized, I still felt off balance. My work mistakes increased, costing me significantly. If I made a wrong trade for a client, I had to fix it. I was constantly on edge, worried about an accident orchestrated by Jonathan and his allies as retaliation. My anxiety spiked as I waited for the feds to act against everyone involved. One night, while sitting at home wondering how my life had unraveled so fast, the doorbell rang. It was already 9 p.m. When I opened the door, I saw Heather. She was crying, a large red mark on her face that would surely bruise by morning. She looked at me briefly before dropping her eyes to the floor. "Stan, please, can I talk to you?" she said. I almost refused and shut the door in her face, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped aside, inviting her in without a word. I led her to the living room and sat in a chair, making sure the security cameras had a clear view. I positioned her on the couch so the cameras would capture her better. Heather sat, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she spoke. "Stan, I know it's too late, but She took a shaky breath. "I need to apologize for what I did to us. I knew better, but he broke through my defenses. You know how much I love attention and ambition. He figured out exactly how to play me, and I fell hard. He seemed like my perfect match, and I couldn't resist. I was blinded by the promise of a high-profile job he said I'd get after the election. I lost sight of what we had." Her sobs grew louder. She looked at me with tear-streaked eyes. "Do you know how angry I was at you on New Year's Eve when you tried to separate us? Stan, by then it was too late. The last time you pulled me away from Jonathan, we had just returned from one of Doug's bedrooms. He convinced me to be with him less than 3 hours after we met. I'm so sorry, but within 3 weeks of sneaking around, I was all in with him. He promised he'd divorce his wife and marry me after the election, saying he couldn't do it sooner without risking his campaign. I fell for the dream of being married to a mayor, maybe even a future senator or governor." She wiped her eyes and continued. "After you caused trouble, Jonathan started pulling away. Tonight at the office, I found him in the storage room with one of the young student volunteers. You were right, Stan. He was feeding her the same lies he told me, promising to leave his wife and marry her after the election. I confronted him and he laughed at me. He asked why I thought he'd marry an old, washed-up hoe like me, especially one who'd cheated on her husband. He said if I played nice, I could stay as his social secretary, maybe entertain his important clients as I'd done before. His new fling laughed at me, and when I slapped him, he slapped me back. Stan, I know it's too late for us, but I want you to know that I finally understand. I'm truly sorry for what I did to us, to you. If there's any way you could forgive me, I'd love to try again. I always knew I had a good man, but there was something about Jonathan that I couldn't resist. The idea of living a high-profile life with him clouded my judgment. Heather looked at me for another moment as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. Then, with a hesitant smile, she stood, walked over to my chair, and kissed me gently on the cheek before running out of the room and out of the house. I sat there, stunned, before getting up and watching her car drive away. I sighed, wishing she had realized all of this before getting involved with Jonathan and his union and government allies. I turned and went back to the den. After a few days, I couldn't take the reminders and pain any longer. I decided to sell the house and hired a real estate agent to help me find a new home without the memories. I brought in a crew to pack up my belongings and send them to storage, another crew to clean the house, and one more to maintain the yard. I stayed in touch with Doug and Sally occasionally. They told me the feds were keeping the investigation under wraps, concerned about potential corruption within the police. We agreed that my name would stay out of it, and the information I provided Sally would only be used if necessary. Sally later informed me that the feds found enough evidence of corruption and were honoring that agreement. Almost 6 weeks after I decided to sell my house, I woke up to a special news bulletin airing on all the major news channels. The feds had arrested everyone involved in Jonathan's misuse of Heather, charging them with a range of offenses, including misuse of funds, corruption, misconduct, campaign violations, and racketeering. Jonathan was arrested for misusing campaign funds, accepting illegal donations, and selling rights to appointive positions in his anticipated administration. Heather, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, was also arrested for her involvement. I called Sally as soon as her office opened to learn more. She said that the information leaked had come from sources other than me, which meant Jonathan's payout to me was safe. He couldn't reclaim the money, and if he attempted to sue me over the non-disclosure agreement, I'd likely win, since the news attributed the tip to 2 campaign staffers. I hoped I wouldn't be suspected of exposing union officials, as I didn't want any trouble from unsavory characters showing up at my door. I smiled, recalling how I had discreetly slipped incriminating notes and documents into the papers some staff handled when I was supposedly at the office looking for Heather. After finishing my call with Sally, I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. I had gotten my revenge on Jonathan and freed myself from Heather at only the cost of attorney fees. Plus, Jonathan's settlement had made me $1.7 million richer. Now, I could look forward to finding a decent woman to marry and starting a new chapter in my life. After those tumultuous events, life settled into a new, quieter normal. I had moved to a smaller, modern apartment that held no memories of my past with Heather. The sharp pain of betrayal dulled over time, leaving behind a deep sense of resilience. The news cycles continued to churn out updates on Jonathan's downfall, the investigations, and the trials of his associates. Heather's involvement was minor in comparison to the political heavyweights, but seeing her name associated with the scandal still sent a twinge through me. Doug and I continued our friendship, stronger now than ever before. He helped me reconnect with a sense of stability, arranging dinners and casual nights out that reminded me of simpler times before ambition and deceit had complicated everything. His loyalty and support were unwavering, a constant anchor. One crisp autumn evening, I stood on the balcony of my new place, watching the city skyline fade into twilight. The air felt different, lighter. For the first time in a long while, I breathed, without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on my chest. I'd learned that trust was fragile, ambition could consume, and loyalty was the rarest of virtues. A month later, while volunteering at a local charity event Doug had encouraged me to attend, I met someone new, Elena, a soft-spoken artist with kind eyes and an infectious laugh. Unlike the whirlwind that had been Heather, she exuded a calming energy that made every conversation feel like a quiet escape. I didn't rush into anything. I had learned the value of patience. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I found myself opening up, letting the cautious tendrils of hope take root once more. Life had changed, irrevocably and painfully, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and unexpectedly ready for a new beginning.
When the company brought in the new boss, I had a feeling things might change, but I didn't expect things to get complicated this quickly. My wife and I worked for the same company, a decent-sized firm where everyone generally kept to themselves, and work was just that, work. Then, out of nowhere, they brought in this new guy as our boss. Apparently, my wife knew him from before. She mentioned that they'd gotten along well in the past, and now, if things went smoothly, it could make our lives easier. It didn't sit well with me from the start, but I kept my thoughts to myself. The last thing I wanted was to cause unnecessary tension at home over something that could turn out to be nothing. Soon enough, I noticed changes. The boss started keeping my wife late after hours. Not just once or twice, it became a regular thing. She'd come home later and later, and each time, she seemed to have some explanation for it. Just wrapping up, or he needed some extra help with a report. It wasn't the staying late that bothered me as much as the pattern. I couldn't ignore it. So one evening, I decided to confront her. I asked why it was always her that had to stay late. Why not anyone else? Why did this guy seem to rely on her so much more than he did anyone else in the office? She didn't get defensive, which I appreciated. She just said that maybe it had something to do with her getting a promotion soon. She explained that they were discussing possibilities, and her staying late might be a good sign. It meant she was being considered. She sounded genuinely excited about it, and I'll admit, I wanted to believe her. If it was true, a promotion would be good for us. Extra money, maybe less stress down the line. Still, something about it didn't feel right. I didn't say anything more at the time, just nodded and let her have her excitement. Days passed, and it kept happening. He'd keep her late, sometimes well past dinner time. I cooked for myself, ate alone, and watched the clock tick. She always had the same story, something about work, something about making an impression. I could tell she thought this was her shot at moving up in the company, and for a while, I tried to support her, even if my gut kept telling me otherwise. It didn't make sense to me why a new boss, who barely knew the team, would single her out this much. But I didn't want to come off as the jealous type, so I held back. Then, just like she said, the promotion came. One day, she walked through the door with this grin on her face, holding a bottle of wine she must have picked up on the way home. She told me they'd promoted her, better title, better pay, more opportunities. She looked genuinely happy, and I could see how much it meant to her. She said it was all thanks to the new boss giving her a chance to prove herself. I nodded, congratulated her, and we celebrated that night, just the two of us at the kitchen table. But deep down, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't about the promotion, I wanted her to succeed. It was about the way it happened, the circumstances around it. There was no denying that her boss had taken a special interest in her, and I wasn't sure why. She tried to reassure me, saying that everything was professional, that she was just putting in the work to get ahead. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. But part of me wondered if I was seeing the full picture. I decided not to push it any further, not right then. I didn't want to ruin what should have been a good moment for her. As the days went on, I tried to bury my doubts. She started coming home at regular hours again, and things almost went back to normal, at least on the surface. But every time she mentioned her boss, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. I watched her closely, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust him. Something about the way she spoke of him, about how he saw potential in her, it rubbed me the wrong way. Still, I kept my mouth shut. I figured I'd give it time and see if things settled down. After the promotion, my wife suggested we invite her boss and his wife over for a barbecue. She insisted it would be a good idea, a way to build connections and keep things smooth at work. I wasn't exactly thrilled about having this guy in my backyard, but I agreed. If this was important to her, I'd go along with it. Besides, maybe I'd get a better read on him in a more casual setting. We set a date for the weekend, and I spent most of that Saturday prepping the grill and getting everything ready. I wasn't about to half-ass this. If we were doing it, we were doing it right. The day of the barbecue, they showed up right on time. Her boss, Greg was all smiles, acting like we were old friends, which I found a bit strange considering we barely knew each other. His wife, though, caught my attention immediately. She looked tired, not just a little worn out, but genuinely exhausted. Her smile seemed forced, and her eyes had that hollow look like she'd rather be anywhere else. I couldn't help but notice it. As we all sat down in the backyard, I made small talk, trying to get a feel for her. But Greg seemed to answer every question for her, cutting her off before she could say much of anything. She just nodded along, like she was used to it. At one point, while my wife and Greg were off talking about work, I took the opportunity to ask his wife if everything was all right. She gave me a quick smile, barely lifting her eyes, and before she could say a word, Greg was right there, jumping in with an answer. He said she'd just been feeling a bit under the weather lately, nothing serious. She nodded, not saying anything, just looking down at her plate. It was odd, the way he controlled the conversation, the way she seemed to fade into the background. I didn't push it any further, but it stuck with me. Something about the way she looked and acted just didn't sit right. The rest of the barbecue went off without any major issues. We ate, drank, and made small talk. My wife seemed to enjoy herself, laughing and chatting with Greg like they were old friends. I played along, but my attention kept drifting back to his wife. She hardly spoke, and when she did, it was only when Greg wasn't around. She seemed nervous, like she was walking on eggshells. It wasn't my place to pry, but I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on there. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Later that night, after everyone had left and we were cleaning up, I brought it up to my wife. I told her what I'd noticed, how Greg's wife seemed off, how she barely spoke unless he was out of earshot. My wife just shrugged it off, saying that maybe she was just tired. She reminded me that Greg's wife had mentioned not feeling well, and maybe that was all there was to it. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. It wasn't just tiredness, it was something deeper, something that made me uneasy. My wife told me not to worry about it, that it wasn't our business, and maybe she was right. But the image of Greg's wife, sitting there with that empty look in her eyes, stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the way Greg controlled every aspect of their conversation, the way his wife seemed to shrink in his presence, it all felt off. I decided to let it go for the moment, but I made a mental note to keep an eye on things. Over the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind, but it kept creeping back in. I couldn't help but replay the barbecue in my head, the way Greg's wife barely spoke, the way she seemed to disappear into herself whenever he was around. My wife seemed content to move on, but I wasn't so sure. I wasn't about to start accusing anyone of anything without proof, but I knew I'd be watching more closely from now on. Maybe my wife was right, and it was nothing more than exhaustion or a rough patch. But I'd seen enough to know that sometimes, things aren't always what they seem. I wasn't going to ignore my gut just because it was easier that way. If there was something going on, I'd find out eventually. For now, I'd keep my eyes open and wait for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. A while after the barbecue, I started noticing something different. My wife was bringing home a lot more money. It wasn't just a small raise, it was significant. I didn't ask about it at first, thinking maybe it was just part of her recent promotion. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that this was more than just a regular pay bump. One evening, as we were having dinner, she casually mentioned that she'd been promoted again. This time, it wasn't just a title change, it came with a hefty salary increase. She seemed proud, and I could see why. But something about it felt off to me, like it was happening too fast. She didn't stop there. She told me to be ready because she was working on something else involving me. That caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting anything to change in my career, and I wasn't sure what she meant. She said she'd been talking to her boss about opportunities for me as well, that they were almost finalized. I nodded, but it made me uneasy. I wasn't sure how I felt about my career being discussed without me, especially with someone like Greg. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being pushed into something I hadn't asked for. It wasn't long before her colleagues started reaching out to me. Some sent messages, others even called. They were congratulating me, saying how great it was that things were moving forward for both of us. They spoke as if it was all a done deal, as if they knew more about what was happening in my life than I did. It made me uncomfortable. I wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, and I definitely wasn't used to people assuming I was on board with something I hadn't even agreed to yet. I thanked them, tried to be polite, but inside, I felt like I was losing control of the situation. My wife, on the other hand, seemed thrilled. She talked about how everything was finally coming together for us, how this was the break we'd been waiting for. She spoke about Greg as if he was some kind of savior, the guy who was making all our dreams come true. I tried to share in her excitement, but it wasn't easy. I didn't trust Greg, and I wasn't sure I wanted anything from him. The more she talked about him, the more I felt like he was trying to insert himself into our lives in a way that made me uneasy. It was one thing for my wife to get a promotion, but it was another for him to be pulling strings for me without my consent. One night, after another congratulatory call from one of her coworkers, I decided to bring it up. I asked my wife why everyone seemed so certain about my future when I hadn't even been told the details. She brushed it off, saying that it was all part of the plan, that she wanted to surprise me. She said that Greg had connections and that he was willing to help me get ahead, just like he had helped her. I didn't like the sound of it. I told her I wasn't comfortable with surprises when it came to my career. I wanted to know exactly what was going on before any decisions were made. She looked a little hurt, like she didn't understand why I wasn't more grateful. She said she was just trying to help, that this was a good thing for us. I didn't want to argue, so I let it drop. But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too fast, that I was being pulled along without a say. I appreciated that she wanted the best for us, but I needed to feel like I had some control over my own life. I wasn't about to let someone like Greg decide my future for me, no matter how much he had supposedly done for my wife. The next few days were tense. My wife kept talking about the opportunities coming our way, about how we needed to be ready for the changes. I tried to stay supportive, but it was hard. Every time she mentioned Greg, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was manipulating things, that he had his own agenda. My wife seemed blind to it, caught up in the excitement of her promotions and the money coming in. I didn't want to burst her bubble, but I couldn't ignore my instincts. As more messages and calls came in from her coworkers, I started to feel like I was being backed into a corner. Everyone seemed to know what was happening except for me. They all talked as if this was the natural next step, as if it was only right that I should be getting a boost thanks to Greg's influence. But I didn't want to owe anything to Greg. I didn't trust the guy, and I wasn't comfortable with the idea of him having any say over my career. I knew I had to find a way to take back control, to make sure that whatever happened next was on my terms, not his. The time came for another get-together, this time at Greg's place. My wife was excited, as always, eager to keep up the connection. I wasn't particularly looking forward to it, but I knew it was important to her, so I went along with it. We arrived at their house, and I immediately noticed that Greg's wife, Karen, looked even more worn out than the last time I saw her. She was polite, smiled when she needed to, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness that seemed to run deep. It wasn't just tiredness, it was something more, and it bothered me. As the evening went on, we all made small talk, the usual pleasantries that come with these kinds of gatherings. Greg was his usual charming self, always in control of the conversation, always the one steering things where he wanted them to go. My wife seemed perfectly at ease, laughing at his jokes, engaging in discussions about work and future plans. I tried to play along, but my attention kept drifting to Karen. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft, almost hesitant, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. At one point, my wife excused herself to go to the bathroom, leaving me alone with Greg and Karen. Greg got up to grab something from the kitchen, and I saw my chance. I leaned in a bit closer to Karen and asked her if everything was all right. I kept my voice low, not wanting to draw attention. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or resignation. She shook her head slightly and whispered that this wasn't the place to talk about it. Before I could say anything else, Greg was back, and the moment was gone. Greg must have noticed that I'd been talking to Karen, because he came over and put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from her and towards the other side of the room. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that felt more like a warning than anything else. He told me that Karen had been feeling under the weather lately, that there was nothing to worry about. He said it in that smooth, confident way of his, like he was used to people taking his word without question. I nodded, but I didn't believe him. There was more to it, I was sure of that, but I wasn't about to push it right then and there. After that, Greg shifted the conversation to me. He mentioned that there were opportunities coming up at work, something that might interest me. He said it in a way that made it clear he wasn't just making small talk. He looked me in the eye and said that soon I'd have a chance to receive an offer that would be hard to refuse. I didn't like the way he said it, like he already knew what my answer would be. I forced a smile and told him I'd think about it, but inside, I felt a mix of anger and unease. I didn't like being cornered, and I definitely didn't like the idea of Greg trying to pull me into whatever he had planned. The rest of the evening went by in a blur. My wife came back, and the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, work, upcoming projects, plans for the future. I tried to stay engaged, but my mind kept drifting back to Karen and what she'd said, or rather, what she hadn't said. There was something going on, something that Greg was keeping under wraps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it all came to the surface. My wife seemed oblivious, caught up in the excitement of the evening, and I didn't want to spoil it for her, so I kept my thoughts to myself. As we left Greg's house that night, my wife was all smiles, talking about how well the evening had gone and how great it was that Greg was looking out for me. I nodded along, not wanting to dampen her mood, but inside, I felt a growing sense of unease. Greg wasn't just looking out for me, he was trying to control the situation, trying to pull me into something I didn't fully understand. And Karen, there was something wrong there, something that Greg was hiding. I knew I couldn't ignore it, not if I wanted to protect myself and my wife from whatever was coming. Over the next few days, I kept replaying the evening in my head. The way Karen looked at me, the way Greg stepped in before she could say too much, the way he talked about the opportunity coming my way, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I knew I needed to be careful, to keep my eyes open and not let myself get pulled in without understanding what was really going on. Greg was playing a game, and I wasn't about to let myself be a pawn in it. Not long after the evening at Greg's house, I noticed something else that caught my attention. One evening, while I was using our shared computer, I stumbled upon some strange search queries in the browser history. They were related to large bedroom toys, the kind of thing that definitely wasn't part of our usual conversations. It struck me as odd, and I couldn't just let it go without saying something. It wasn't the kind of thing I could ignore. So later that night, I decided to bring it up with my wife. I asked her about it directly. I didn't accuse her of anything, didn't raise my voice, I just wanted to know what was going on. She looked at me for a moment, then laughed, like it was no big deal. She said it was just a joke between her and one of her friends. Apparently, her friend had been joking around, and they'd looked it up together. She said her friend was in an open relationship and had been talking about all sorts of things, and it had come up as part of their conversation. She made it sound like it was just harmless curiosity, nothing more. I took her at her word. She seemed calm, and I didn't see any reason to doubt her. She explained that her friend was just messing around and that they were having a light-hearted conversation. It didn't seem like anything worth making a fuss over. I told her that I wasn't particularly interested in those kinds of topics, but if it was just a joke, then fine. She nodded and reassured me that it was nothing serious. I let it go at that, not wanting to blow things out of proportion. She also mentioned that her friend had asked her opinion on open relationships, and they got to talking about different things. I made my stance clear, I wasn't interested in that kind of lifestyle, and I believed that marriage was meant for two people, nothing more. She understood and didn't argue. She said it was simply an interesting discussion and nothing more than that. She seemed genuinely fine with my response, and we moved on from the topic without any tension. From that point on, I decided not to dwell on it. My wife had given me an explanation, and it made sense. People have all kinds of conversations, and sometimes they look things up just out of curiosity. There was no point in reading too much into it. We had a good marriage, and I trusted her. I wasn't going to let something small turn into an issue when there wasn't any real reason for it. The next few days went on as usual. My wife acted like everything was normal, like our conversation hadn't been anything significant. She went about her routine, smiling, talking about work, making plans for the weekend. I did the same. Life was busy, and we had enough on our plates without me worrying about something that was already settled. If she said it was just a joke, I believed her. There was no need to make things more complicated than they needed to be. I knew that the best way forward was to keep focusing on what mattered, our life together, our plans, and our future. There was no point in letting small doubts creep in where they didn't belong. We had worked hard to build a good life, and I wasn't going to let anything disrupt that. My wife had always been straightforward with me, and I had no reason to think otherwise now. The next evening, after dinner, my wife approached me with an idea. She suggested that we should spice things up and have some fun. At first, I wasn't quite sure what she meant, but then she mentioned inviting Greg over. That threw me off. I couldn't understand why she'd want to bring her boss into something that should have been just between us. I asked her what she meant, and she started to explain, her tone casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Not long after, Greg arrived. He walked in like he owned the place, all smiles and charm, but there was something unsettling about it. My wife seemed relaxed, almost excited, which only added to my confusion. Then they both sat down, and Greg began to speak. He mentioned the opportunities at work again, the ones he had hinted at before. But this time, he didn't stop there. He started talking about fantasies, about ways we could all benefit if I was willing to participate. It took me a moment to realize what he was implying, but once it clicked, I felt a surge of anger. Greg and my wife were suggesting that I become a part of their sexual fantasies, offering me a good position at work and a significant salary increase in return. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, the person I trusted more than anyone, was sitting there, nodding along as if this was a perfectly reasonable proposition. The more Greg talked, the angrier I became. He spoke like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for the opportunity. It was sickening. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. I couldn't listen to another word of it. I demanded that they both leave. I told Greg that he had no right to come into my home and make such disgusting suggestions. I looked at my wife, and I could see the shock on her face. Maybe she hadn't expected me to react this way. But I didn't care. This was beyond anything I could tolerate, and I wasn't about to let it continue for another second. Greg tried to calm me down, saying that I was overreacting, that we should all just sit down and talk it through. But I wasn't interested in talking. I wanted him out of my house, and I made that very clear. I wasn't about to let someone like him manipulate me or my wife. I didn't care what kind of opportunities he was offering. No job, no amount of money, was worth compromising my dignity. I told him to leave, and I meant it. My wife tried to say something, to explain or justify what was happening, but I cut her off. There was nothing she could say that would make this okay. The fact that she had even entertained the idea was enough to make me question everything. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious all at once. I wasn't going to stand there and listen to excuses. I wanted them both gone, and I wasn't going to ask again. Greg finally got the message. He stood up, still trying to maintain that smug smile, but I could see the tension in his eyes. He said something about reconsidering, about how this could be a missed opportunity, but I didn't care. I watched as he walked out the door, my wife following behind him, still trying to say something to me. I didn't want to hear it. I closed the door behind them, locking it, and stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. That night, I sat alone in the living room, my mind racing. I couldn't believe how far things had gone, how twisted everything had become. The betrayal cut deep, but more than that, I felt a sense of resolve. I wasn't going to let anyone, not Greg, not even my wife, dictate my life or push me into something I didn't want. I knew that from this point on, things were going to change. There was no going back to the way things were before, and I was ready to face whatever came next. After Greg and my wife left, I was done with the confusion and guessing games. I knew what had happened. My wife had betrayed me, and Greg was behind all of it. There was nothing left to figure out. I wasn't interested in understanding Greg's twisted motives or my wife's excuses. I wanted one thing, to make sure Karen, Greg's wife, knew exactly what kind of man she was married to. I picked up my phone and called Karen. She answered after a few rings, her voice hesitant. I wasted no time getting to the point. I told her what had just happened, that Greg had come into my home and tried to pull me into some sick game, offering me a promotion in exchange for becoming part of their twisted fantasies. I made it clear that my wife had been in on it, that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was a long silence on the other end before she finally spoke. Karen's voice was shaky, but she didn't sound surprised. She admitted that she already knew about Greg's behavior. She said she had known for a long time what kind of man he was. She told me that she was in a similar situation herself, that Greg had been forcing her into things she didn't want to do for years. She said that he cheated on her regularly and that he was abusive, both physically and emotionally. She stayed because she felt she had no choice. He controlled the money, the house, everything. Hearing her say that made my anger burn even hotter. I wasn't just angry for myself anymore, I was angry for her too. Greg was a monster, and he had been getting away with it for far too long. I told her that she didn't deserve any of this, that no one did. She sounded defeated, like she had accepted her fate, but I wasn't about to let that slide. I told her that she needed to get out, that she couldn't keep living like this. She hesitated, then said that it wasn't that simple. Greg had too much control, too many connections. If she tried to leave, he would ruin her. I could hear the fear in her voice, and I understood it. But I wasn't going to let Greg win. I told her that I was willing to help, that she didn't have to do this alone. She thanked me, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. She had been living in fear for so long that she couldn't see a way out. It was frustrating, but I knew I couldn't push her too hard. She had to make the decision for herself, and all I could do was offer my support. Before we ended the call, Karen told me that she was sorry for what had happened, that she wished she could have warned me sooner. I told her it wasn't her fault. The blame lay squarely on Greg and my wife. I thanked her for being honest with me, and I promised her that if she ever needed anything, I would be there to help. She sounded grateful, but I could still hear the resignation in her voice. It was clear that she didn't believe things could change. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, my anger still simmering. Greg had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let it go. He had not only destroyed my marriage, but he had also been abusing his own wife for years. I knew I had to do something, not just for myself, but for Karen as well. I wasn't interested in playing detective or trying to piece together the truth anymore. I had all the information I needed. Greg was a manipulative, abusive bastard, and it was time someone stood up to him. After my conversation with Karen, I knew it was time to take action. Words were no longer enough, and I wasn't going to sit around waiting for Greg to make his next move. I needed evidence, something concrete that could show exactly what kind of man he was. I decided to get a recording device and a camera. If Greg thought he could walk all over people without consequences, he was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't going to let him get away with it, not anymore. I went to an electronics store the next day and bought a small recording device and a discreet camera. I wanted something that could capture everything without being noticed. I wasn't sure what my next encounter with Greg would look like, but I knew I needed to be prepared. I wasn't going to let myself be caught off guard again. I wanted proof, something undeniable, that I could use to expose him, both to the authorities and to anyone else who needed to know the truth. When I got home, I took my time setting everything up. The camera was small enough to hide in the closet, positioned so that it would have a clear view of the living room. It was the perfect spot, out of sight, but able to capture everything that happened. I tested it a few times to make sure it worked, adjusting the angle until I was satisfied. I needed this to be done right. There couldn't be any mistakes. Next, I hid the recording device. It was tiny, easy to conceal. I decided to tape it under the table in the living room, where any conversation would be clearly picked up. I tested it as well, speaking at different volumes to make sure it would catch every word. The quality was good, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I was ready. If Greg or my wife tried anything again, I'd have the evidence I needed to prove what they were up to. But I wasn't naive. I knew that things could still go wrong. Greg was unpredictable, and there was no telling how he might react if he realized what I was doing. I needed to be ready for anything, including the possibility that things could get violent. So I took one more precaution. I took a kitchen knife and taped it to the bottom of one of the chairs in the living room. It wasn't something I wanted to use, but if it came down to it, I wasn't going to let myself be a victim. I had to be ready for whatever might happen. Once everything was set, I took a step back and looked around the living room. It looked the same as always, nothing out of place, nothing to give away what I had done. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in days. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I had some control. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was taking action. I was ready for whatever came next, and I wasn't going to back down. That night, I went over everything in my head, making sure I hadn't missed anything. I knew there was no guarantee that Greg would come back, or that my wife would try to pull something again. But if they did, I'd be ready. I wasn't going to let them catch me off guard, not this time. I was done being the one who was always a step behind, always trying to figure out what was happening. Now, I was the one setting the trap. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let Greg or anyone else take advantage of me again. I had the camera, the recorder, and the knife. I was ready for whatever came next, and I wasn't afraid. If they wanted to test me, they'd find out soon enough that I wasn't the kind of man who backed down. Not anymore. I knew it was time to put my plan into action. I picked up the phone and called my wife, telling her that I was ready. There was a moment of silence before she agreed, saying that she and Greg would be over soon. I hung up and took a deep breath. I had everything set up, the camera, the recorder, and even the knife under the chair. I wasn't going to back down, and I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. This was it. It was time to get the evidence I needed. It wasn't long before I heard the knock at the door. I opened it to see my wife standing there, Greg right behind her, looking as smug as ever. They walked in, and Greg wasted no time getting to the point. He asked if I had finally come around, if I was ready to take the offer he'd made. I looked him in the eye and asked him what exactly I would get in return for my agreement. He smiled, that same arrogant smile, and repeated his proposal: a higher position at work, more money, and all the benefits that came with it. All I had to do was go along with what they wanted. I nodded, pretending to consider it. I could see the satisfaction on Greg's face, like he thought he had won. I agreed, telling them that I was willing to do what they wanted. My wife looked relieved, and she disappeared into the other room for a moment. When she came back, she was holding an oversized toy, the kind that I had seen in those strange search queries. I kept my expression neutral, watching as she handed it to Greg. They both looked at me, waiting for a reaction, but I stayed calm. I needed them to think I was on board with this. Greg and my wife wasted no time. They started right there in front of me, acting like I was just a bystander, like my presence didn't matter. I clenched my jaw, my eyes fixed on them, but I stayed still. I needed to wait, to let the camera and recorder capture everything. I needed enough evidence to make sure there was no denying what they were doing. The anger inside me was building, but I kept it in check. I couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. As the minutes passed, I could feel my patience wearing thin. They were so caught up in themselves that they didn't even notice me watching. They thought they had me beaten, that I was just going to sit there and let them humiliate me. But they were wrong. I had waited long enough. I stood up, and they barely even noticed. I walked over to where Greg had put the toy, my hand shaking with anger. I grabbed it, and without warning, I swung it at him. The first hit caught Greg completely off guard. He stumbled, a look of shock on his face. My wife screamed, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, the anger that I had held back for so long finally unleashed. Greg tried to defend himself, but he was too stunned to react. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, not after everything he had done, not after everything he had tried to take from me. I wanted him to understand that I wasn't someone he could control, that I wasn't going to be his pawn. My wife tried to pull me back, screaming at me to stop, but I barely heard her. All I could see was Greg, the man who had tried to ruin my life, who had manipulated my wife, who had treated us both like we were nothing. I didn't stop until I saw the fear in his eyes, until I knew that he understood that this was over. I threw the toy to the side, my breathing heavy, and looked down at him. He was on the floor, gasping, his arrogance completely gone. I stepped back, my wife still screaming, tears streaming down her face. I didn't care. I had done what I needed to do. I had taken back control. I looked at Greg one last time and told him to get out of my house. He struggled to his feet, stumbling towards the door. My wife followed him, still crying, but I didn't stop them. I watched as they left, slamming the door behind them. The room was quiet now, and I felt a sense of finality. It was over. They thought they could break me, but they were wrong. I wasn't broken, not by a long shot. After Greg and my wife left the house, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle in. The anger was still there, but it had cooled into a steady resolve. There was no going back now, and I didn't want to. My marriage was over, and it was time to make that clear. I walked through the house, gathering all of my wife's belongings, her clothes, her personal items, anything that belonged to her. I wasn't going to let any trace of her stay in my home. I grabbed some trash bags and started packing her things, not caring about keeping them neat or organized. As I worked, I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. Once I had everything packed up, I took the bags out to the curb and left them there. I went back inside, locked the door, and took a deep breath. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. When my wife eventually tried to come back, she found her things on the curb and the locks changed. She pounded on the door, shouting, demanding that I let her in, but I ignored her. I told her through the closed door that I was done, that I wanted a divorce. There was nothing left to discuss. She tried to argue, tried to plead, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I had made up my mind, and there was no changing it. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and there was no forgiveness for that. After she finally left, I turned my attention to the evidence I had gathered. The camera and the recorder had captured everything that had happened, every disgusting detail of Greg's proposition and their actions. I knew what I had to do. I took the footage and brought it to the police. I explained everything, Greg's manipulation, his abuse of power, the way he had tried to use his position to coerce me and my wife. The officers listened, and I could see the seriousness in their faces as they watched the footage. There was no denying what Greg had done. It didn't take long for the consequences to come down. Greg was fired from his position, his career in ruins. My wife, too, was let go. She had been complicit in everything, and there was no way she could stay at the company after what had happened. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. They had thought they could do whatever they wanted without repercussions, but they had been wrong. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Karen, Greg's wife. She had been through so much, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. I decided to reach out to her, to see if there was anything I could do to help. When I called her, she sounded surprised, but also relieved. We met for coffee, and she opened up to me about everything she had endured. It was heartbreaking to hear, but I was glad she finally had someone she could talk to, someone who understood. I made it clear to Karen that she didn't have to go through this alone anymore. I offered to help her in any way I could, whether it was finding a place to stay, getting legal advice, or just being there to listen. She had been isolated for so long, and I wanted her to know that she had support now. As we talked, I could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a hint of strength that had been buried under years of fear and control. It felt good to be able to do something positive after everything that had happened. Over time, Karen and I grew closer. It wasn't romantic, not yet, at least, but there was a genuine connection between us. We had both been hurt by the same man, both been betrayed by people we should have been able to trust. We understood each other's pain in a way that no one else could. Helping her gave me a sense of purpose, a way to move forward from the wreckage of my marriage. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. It had been a while since I had last seen either Greg or my wife, and I had hoped that it would stay that way. But one evening, there was a loud, insistent knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I looked out the window, I saw them, Greg and my wife, standing on my porch, both of them looking angry. My heart began to race, and I knew that this wasn't going to be a peaceful conversation. They had come looking for trouble, and I wasn't about to let them intimidate me in my own home. I grabbed the gun I had bought for protection, something I had hoped I would never need to use, and approached the door. I opened it just enough to see them, but kept the gun hidden behind my back. Greg started yelling immediately, demanding to know why I had gone to the police, why I had tried to ruin his life. My wife stood beside him, her arms crossed, looking just as furious. They both thought they could come here and bully me into backing down, but they were wrong. I stepped back and told them both to leave. I made it clear that I wasn't interested in hearing anything they had to say, and that if they didn't leave, there would be consequences. Greg's face turned red with anger, and he stepped forward, shoving the door open. He yelled that he wasn't going anywhere until he got what he wanted, that I was going to pay for what I had done. I could see the rage in his eyes, and I knew that things were about to escalate. Without hesitation, I pulled out the gun and pointed it at him. I told him to back off, that this was his last warning. My wife gasped, her eyes wide with fear, but Greg wasn't backing down. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for the gun, his face twisted in anger. In that split second, I knew I had no choice. I pulled the trigger, and the gun went off. The sound was deafening, and Greg stumbled backward, clutching his leg as he fell to the ground. My wife screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood was seeping through his pants, and he was writhing in pain, cursing at me. I kept the gun pointed at them, my hand shaking, but I didn't lower it. I told my wife to call an ambulance, and she fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling. I could hear her sobbing as she spoke to the operator, but I kept my focus on Greg. He had tried to attack me in my own home, and I wasn't going to let my guard down until the police arrived. It didn't take long for the sirens to echo down the street. The police arrived, their lights flashing, and I put the gun down, raising my hands to show that I wasn't a threat. They rushed in, quickly assessing the situation. One officer handcuffed Greg, while another spoke to me, asking what had happened. I explained everything, how Greg had forced his way into my home, how he had attacked me, and how I had fired in self-defense. My wife was still crying, but she didn't deny what had happened. They took Greg away in an ambulance, and I was taken down to the station for questioning. I told them everything, and they listened carefully. I was honest about what had happened, and after reviewing the evidence, they decided that I had acted in self-defense. It was a relief, but the whole ordeal had left me shaken. Greg had tried to control me, to intimidate me, but in the end, he had only hurt himself. He was charged with breaking and entering an assault, and they locked him up. In the days that followed, I tried to come to terms with everything that had happened. It wasn't easy, but I knew that I had done what I had to do. Greg and my wife had made their choices, and they had paid the price for them. I wasn't proud of what I had done, but I knew that it had been necessary. I had protected myself, and I had stood my ground. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmare that Greg had brought into my life was finally over, and I was ready to move on. Time passed after the incident with Greg, and life slowly began to settle into a new normal. I focused on rebuilding, on putting the pieces of my life back together after everything that had happened. I hadn't heard from my wife since that night, and I was grateful for the silence. I needed time to heal, to move forward without the constant reminders of betrayal. But one day, out of the blue, there she was, standing at my doorstep, her eyes filled with tears. She looked different, more vulnerable, more desperate. She asked if we could talk, and I could see that she had been crying even before she arrived. I didn't want to let her in, didn't want to hear what she had to say, but there was a part of me that needed closure. So I stepped aside and let her in, closing the door behind her. She stood there, wringing her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something familiar. She started talking, her voice trembling. She apologized for everything, for betraying me, for lying, for letting Greg manipulate her. She said that she had made a terrible mistake, that she regretted everything she had done, and that she wanted to come back. She begged me to give her another chance, to forget everything that had happened and start over. She promised that things would be different, that she would never hurt me again. Her words were full of desperation, and I could see that she meant them. But it was too late. I listened to her, letting her say everything she needed to say. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret, the fear of losing everything. But as I stood there, I realized that I felt nothing for her anymore. The love that had once been there had been shattered by her betrayal, and there was no putting it back together. I told her that. I told her that what she had done was unforgivable, that there was no going back. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. She started crying, begging me to reconsider. She said that she couldn't imagine her life without me, that she had realized how much she loved me and how wrong she had been. But her words fell flat. I had heard enough lies, enough promises that meant nothing. I wasn't about to let myself be pulled back into the mess that she had created. I had moved on, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the past. I told her that it was over, that I had no interest in trying to fix something that was beyond repair. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how I could be so cold. But it wasn't about being cold, it was about protecting myself, about making sure I never went through that kind of pain again. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. There was no coming back from that. She stood there for a moment, as if hoping I might change my mind. But I didn't. I turned away from her, making it clear that the conversation was over. She sobbed, pleading one last time, but I didn't respond. Eventually, she left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she walked away. I closed the door behind her, locking it, and felt a sense of finality. It was truly over, and I was ready to move on. In the days that followed, I felt a strange sense of peace. My wife had tried to come back, but I had stood my ground. I had chosen myself, my own well-being, over the toxic relationship that she had tried to resurrect. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. I knew that I deserved better, and I wasn't going to settle for anything less. The past was behind me, and I was ready to embrace whatever the future had in store.
From the start, our relationship was predictable and routine. Amy and I met at a work event, bonding over shared experiences with life, marriage, and navigating blended families. When we got married, it felt like everything fell into place. We both had kids from previous relationships, so building a family took some work, but we managed, or so I thought. As time went on, we settled into a routine of raising the kids and focusing on our careers. Life had its challenges, but we always made time to catch up over dinner, even after the kids moved out. We had a life filled with shared responsibilities, vacations, and support for each other's struggles. Everything seemed fine, until the night Amy confessed. It was a typical evening, just the two of us having dinner. I'd made stir-fry since she was late from a school event, which was unusual. We always had dinner together, a tradition we kept to stay connected. Halfway through refilling my coffee, I realized I hadn't fully heard what Amy had just said. She was staring at me, waiting for my response. "What?" I asked, confused. "I don't get it. You're what?" "I've been seeing Cody," she said quickly. "The new gym teacher at school, Cody Bakerfield. You've met him." "I know who Cody is," I replied, feeling uneasy. "So you're seeing him? What does that mean?" Amy sighed. "We've become friends. I've been having lunch with him, and after school we've been going out sometimes." "Going out?" I asked, baffled. "Are you having an affair?" "Yes," she said, watching me closely. I stared in disbelief. "Yes, what? You're having an affair?" "Yes," she repeated, nodding solemnly. "Cliff, I'm telling you because I love and respect you. I always have." "Respect me? Love me?" I gasped. "It's true," she insisted. "You've always been my number one. Marrying you was the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you so much. I just couldn't keep seeing him without telling you." I stared at her, hoping this was some kind of joke. Amy loves me as much as I love her. She couldn't really be having an affair, but she didn't take it back. I was lost. "I don't even know what to say, Amy. I'm so confused." "Don't feel bad, Cliff," she said. "Yes, I've been seeing Cody, but he's just a friend. I don't love him. It hasn't changed anything between us." I clenched my jaw, still in shock. "How can you say you love me?" "I do love you," she insisted. "We have a great marriage, and I'll always value that. But I need other male friends, too." "I've never had a problem with your male friends," I replied. "I know, and I appreciate that. Cody's just a friend. But he's younger and makes me feel like a teenager again sometimes." "Stop," I shouted. My patience snapped. "I don't want to hear the details of your affair. Spare me." Amy, seeing my anger, softened her tone. "I'm sorry, honey. I just wanted to be honest. Yes, I'm seeing Cody, but no one knows. We've been careful. And that's supposed to make me feel better? I know it doesn't. I just want you to understand, Cliff. Cody will never replace you. He's just a fun distraction. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just couldn't hide it anymore." Seething, I repeated her words. "A fun guy? A distraction? Something I'll never miss?" "You selfish, conniving," I spat out, my face burning with rage. "How could you?" She let me vent. "I guess I deserve that." I couldn't take any more. I stood up so fast my chair tipped over. Without a word, I stormed out of the room. "Where are you going, Cliff?" Amy called. "Don't leave, please." "I need to think," I shot back. "Give me a minute." I walked out the back door, leaving her behind. I stormed out onto the deck, furious and trying to catch my breath. An affair? She's cheating on me. The disrespect made my blood boil. I pounded the railing, trying to calm down. I'm usually pretty level-headed, but hearing my wife talk about her infidelity was pushing me over the edge. For years, I'd relied on my calm demeanor as an accountant, keeping cool even with anxious clients. But this was personal. My wife of over 20 years was telling me she was seeing a younger guy from work. I'd met that guy, Cody, at a school event. Amy introduced him as a casual friend, and I foolishly believed her. Now I know the truth. My mind raced with images of what she'd said. I took deep breaths, knowing storming back in and yelling wouldn't help. I had to stay calm and figure out a way to handle this. Yelling would only make her dig in, and that wouldn't get me the information I needed. I needed details to understand the full scope of this. After about 10 minutes, I felt my heart rate return to normal. I walked back inside to face Amy, who was nervously fiddling with her coffee cup. As I sat down, she glanced up at me, but I raised my hand to stop her from speaking. "Let's restart this," I said calmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm shocked, Amy. I never expected this." "You don't have to be, Cliff," she responded, her voice soft. I raised my hand again to cut her off. "Wait, what's your plan here? You think I'll just forgive and forget? You've been seeing someone behind my back and I'm supposed to move on like nothing happened?" Amy shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, not exactly. I knew you'd be upset, but I didn't want to keep you in the dark anymore." I muttered under my breath, "Jesus, so what did that slick guy say when you told him you were going to tell me?" "He thought it was for the best," she replied hesitantly. "That's what he said?" "Not exactly," Amy clarified. "Cody's not a bad guy, Cliff. He feels terrible about sneaking around. We both do." "Really?" "Yes. Neither of us wants to ruin our marriage, she said, looking at me with a pleading expression. I was about to tell her she needed to end the affair when she sighed, her face hardening with determination. This is tough, but now that you know, I want to keep seeing him. Not too often, just occasionally, and after school hours. I was stunned by her audacity and could only manage a sarcastic, "Oh, of course." We sat there in silence, the tension thick between us, until she finally spoke again, looking pained. "I'm so sorry, honey. I know this is hard, but he's a nice guy. We have fun together, and I do like him, but it won't affect us." "You've got to be kidding," I said incredulously. "No, it won't change anything between us. It hasn't so far, and it won't in the future. He's been a good friend to me, and honestly, I think he's been good for our marriage, too." "Really? You're out of your mind." "Cliff, think about it logically. Remember how tense things were last year? You even called me out for being difficult." "Well, I was. Our marriage was in a rut when I first started seeing him," she explained. "Oh, great, so he's a marriage counselor now?" I shot back sarcastically. She ignored the sarcasm. "Cody helped me adjust my attitude. I know you've noticed the change. We're more than friends, but I don't need to see him often. Just occasionally when you're busy. I love you, Cliff. I want to grow old with you, you know that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you're not ending the affair? You want me to accept this?" "It will end eventually," she assured me. "He's younger, and we have different interests. Our feelings will fizzle out over time, just not right now." "You're crazy," I said, unable to mask my disbelief. "Please, Cliff, nothing between us will change. I'm still the same loving wife I've always been. We'll continue our relationship as usual. You haven't noticed anything different, have you?" I hated to admit it, but she was right. I never suspected the reason behind the recent spike in our Zek's life. When we first started dating, Amy and I were very active, but over the years, as the kids got older, things slowed down. Even after they left for college, we never fully returned to our old rhythm. I didn't see it as a problem, figuring most couples our age weren't tearing up the sheets every night. But now, knowing what I did, I realized Amy was right. We had gotten back on track. I couldn't deny I was happy that we were now making love several times a week, just like when the kids were younger. When she asked if I'd noticed any difference while she was seeing Cody, the truth was, I hadn't. When I didn't answer, she spoke for me. "Of course not," she said confidently. "Even while seeing Cody, I've been here for you. We have a great Zek's life for our age, and I love it just as much as you do. Cody is just a small part of my life, nothing more." "We've had a stable 20-year marriage, and you want to continue that?" I asked, incredulous. "Of course. I love you," she said. "But how can I stay married to a cheating strumpet?" I shot back. Her expression hardened. "I'm not a strumpet," she said sharply. "This is the first time I've ever cheated, and I've never been with a man I didn't have feelings for." "So, you have feelings for him?" I asked, outraged. "How do I know you're not just waiting to replace me with him?" "It's not like that, Cliff," she insisted. "You're my husband, and I love you. I'll never leave you. I just need some time with Cody, not all the time and not forever. Just until this urge is out of my system. It won't affect us, just like it hasn't for the past few months." I sat in silence, my mind racing with images of what she'd been doing with him. She kept talking, trying to justify her affair. "It's better for us in the long run, Cliff. I've been more relaxed, more uninhibited in the bedroom. You've noticed, right? I haven't turned you down, and I've let you do things you've wanted for years. Since being with Cody, I've been able to fully express myself. No more hang-ups. You must have felt the difference." She was right again, and it infuriated me. Our Zek's life used to be pretty straightforward. Nothing wild, but satisfying. Amy was a generous lover, and we both enjoyed ourselves. But over the last few months, she'd become incredibly passionate. I thought it was because the kids had left or maybe a hormonal shift as she aged. Now I realized it was her affair with that young guy from school fueling the change. It was depressing. I'd always felt lucky to have her. Amy was a Zexy divorcee, 4 years older, with 2 kids when we met. I fell for her right away, and we clicked. I was happy to marry her and raise her kids as my own. Her first husband was a deadbeat who abandoned them, and I stepped in as the only father her children knew. After 20 years of what I thought was a happy marriage, she dropped this bomb on me. "Say something, Cliff," she urged, watching me closely. "I know you're upset, but I don't want you to feel hurt. Let me help make this easier. You're still my number one." She stood up, smirking, and moved toward me seductively. "I'm here for you, baby. Let me know what you need." When she tried to sit on my lap, I pushed her away. She looked hurt but didn't press it. I stood up abruptly and left the room. As I stormed out, she barely had time to say, "Wait!" before I was out the door and into my car. Driving aimlessly, I realized I needed space before doing something I'd regret. I considered heading to a bar to drown my anger. I found one nearby, parked, and ordered a beer, trying to clear my head. Later, I drove home with a plan. When I walked in, Amy was on her cell phone. She looked startled and whispered quickly, "I have to go. He's back. Bye." By the tense look on her face, I suspected she was talking to her boyfriend. It stung, but I stayed calm. I needed to follow the bartender's advice, gather all the information tonight before deciding what to do next. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the cold coffee cup still in front of me. Amy looked serious. "Cliff," she started, but I interrupted her. "Hold on. I think I need to know how this affair started. Maybe it'll help me process this. So, how long, Amy? How long have you been breaking our vows?" She sighed. "Not long. We've been friends for a while, but it only turned physical a few months ago." She explained how Cody made her feel special and helped her explore her sexuality. She seemed relieved as she shared. "So what now?" I asked. "You've been lying and cheating for months. How am I supposed to feel? You've been with a guy barely older than our kids, and I had no clue. You expect me to applaud your secrecy?" "No, Cliff," she said, reaching for my hand. I tensed but didn't pull away. "I'm ashamed for deceiving you. I hated lying to you, but we were careful. I didn't want you to find out. Cody never pressured me. He was okay with seeing me occasionally and didn't want to ruin our marriage." "That clearly changed," I said bitterly. Amy squeezed my hand. "No matter what, I love you. Cody's a good guy, but he could never replace you." I told him we'd never be more than friends with benefits, and he agreed. We were discreet, even having lunch with other coworkers to avoid suspicion. No one ever knew. "I'm sure you were a clever cheater," I snapped. Amy gave me a sad nod. On the outside, I was the faithful wife with a great job and friends. Inside, I was lying. I always saw myself as honest, but this affair made me hate myself. Our marriage is precious to me, and Cody was just temporary. My feelings for him don't compare to what I feel for you. I started to lose my sense of self because of the deceit. The solution is simple. Stop cheating. "Yes, but I'm not sure I can right now," she admitted. "I'd like to think I could just end it with Cody and everything would go back to normal, but I doubt it." "Why?" I asked, frustrated. "We've built a great life, raised 2 kids, and now have time to enjoy each other. If you love me like you say, giving him up shouldn't be a problem." She exhaled sharply and gave me a worried look. "It might have been easy to stop at first, but now I'm not sure. Of course, I love you, Cliff, but these past few months have shown me another side of life, and I've learned more about myself and my needs. I don't know if I can just go back to how things were, even if I wanted to. I've tried to be the same loving wife, but being with Cody has made me see other possibilities." I yanked my hand away, struggling to stay calm. "Other options, huh?" I snapped. "You can't stop screwing him? Is that it? I was good enough to marry and raise your kids, but now some young guy shows up and I'm not good enough anymore?" "That's not it at all," she said quickly. "You've always been the best husband and father I could have asked for. But after so many years of marriage, I've changed. We both have. It's just natural, not bad. People evolve." I glared at her, speechless. She continued softly, "Cliff, I don't want to hurt you. I know it may not seem like it, but it's true. We're going to stay together and nothing between us will change. I'll make sure of that. I love our life, our marriage, our kids, but I also enjoy this friendship with Cody. He makes me feel things I haven't felt in years. I hope you can understand and love me enough to let me have this." "You witch," I whispered under my breath. If she heard, she didn't react. "It's not a bad thing, Cliff. I'm always here for you. I just want things to stay as they are a little longer, not forever, just until I'm done with this. Then I'll end it with Cody and be yours completely again. I'm being honest because I don't want any more secrets. If you let me do this, I promise I'll make it up to you. I'll always be a good wife, and no one will ever know. Just give me this, and I'll reward you for the rest of our lives." This conversation was spiraling. I had started the night feeling great about my marriage, and within minutes I had gone from a happy husband to a miserable, betrayed one. My wife now had a lover, someone younger and no doubt more exciting than me. It took me a few minutes to gather myself. This was a lot to process. I thought I could reason with her, make her end the affair, but it was clear now. She had no plans to stop. She just wanted my permission to keep exploring her feelings. This was classic cheater's nonsense. You've been lying for months, and you're so good at it that I never suspected a thing. Now you admit to all the lies and cheating, promising to keep me as your husband. But how can I trust you again? You've lied not only to me, but to our kids, our friends, everyone. What's stopping you from changing your mind again? Maybe about Cody or some other guy in the future? Amy sighed in frustration because she knew I was right. She looked at me with teary eyes, wanting to argue, but couldn't. I'd never do that, and you know it, she finally said. You've got some nerve, I said bitterly. Acting so entitled, throwing your affair in my face. Why shouldn't I just leave you? I don't want a cheating wife. I should divorce you and be done with it. I expected those words to hurt, but Amy's expression softened. She looked at me with unexpected compassion and spoke with a new edge. I know this is hard right now, but divorce? That wouldn't be in your best interest, Cliff. Why? At least I'd have my pride. Her pitying look was infuriating. A divorce would hurt both of us, Cliff. At least I wouldn't have to deal with your affair. That's true, she said calmly. But I don't think you'd be happy with a divorce. Neither of us would. Her gaze locked onto mine. We live in a no-fault state. I'd get half of everything. The house, savings, retirement. And because you adopted Martha and Robbie, you'd have to help with their college costs. Plus, there's alimony. Since I don't earn much as a teacher, you'd be expected to support me. It could be a lot. I guess she and her lover had thought this through. So you'd take me to the cleaners, I said flatly. I don't want to, she said. I want to keep living and loving you like before. But if you divorce me, you'll owe a lot, and I'd still be free to see Cody. It'd be better for us to stay married. You'd have me as your loving wife, and we can keep having great sex. No one would ever know. I'll always keep you as my number one. Then she added in a sympathetic tone, I'll always be thankful for your open-mindedness about this, and I'll give you whatever you want. I just want some time with Cody. Not much, just a little. The rest of the time, I'll focus on making you happy. I was happy before you dumped this on me, I said bitterly. Now I know I'm just a fool, putting up with my unfaithful wife and that idiot you work with. It's not like that, Cliff. I started to walk away and she called out, Wait, don't leave, honey. We need to talk about this more. Please. There's nothing to discuss, Amy. You've made your ultimatum. Now I have to decide if I can accept it. There's nothing to worry about, she cried. Nothing between us will change, I promise. I don't want you to think about anything except how much I love you for giving me this freedom. I'll do anything to make you happy. Then end the affair right now. She sighed in frustration, looked down and whispered, I can't do that just yet, honey. I can't stop right now. Then there's nothing more to talk about. This conversation is over. I've heard enough. You've told me how you feel, and nothing I say will change your mind. At the same time, I'll never believe another word you say. I'm done trying to reason with a liar and a cheat. I went to the den and turned on the TV. I didn't care what was on. I was still reeling from the conversation. I thought about going to a hotel and leaving without a word. I was so angry. I wanted to hurt her like she hurt me, but I knew walking out and getting drunk wasn't my style. Maybe I'm too rational or too boring to do something reckless. I felt numb and exhausted. It was like a nightmare. How could she do this to me? I watched TV for another hour. A game was on, but I couldn't tell you a single detail. I heard her leave the kitchen. At some point, the sliding glass doors opened and closed when she went onto the back deck. I guess she was calling someone for privacy, probably her boyfriend telling him how our talk went. She came back in a while later and entered the den. I was in the recliner, so she couldn't sit next to me. She stood close, watching me. Are you okay, Cliff? She asked sweetly. I know this is a lot to take in, honey, and I want to help you. I glanced over and saw her give me a strange smile. Do you want to talk more, or do you want to go to bed? She asked. You know I'll do anything to make you feel better. I really want to. I was disgusted, offering me Zex to ease my pain. Pity Zex for her poor old husband. Probably her boyfriend's idea. Sloppy seconds for the clueless husband. How cliché. The thought made me angry. I ignored her offer and went upstairs to bed. I was furious with my wife and considered sleeping in the guest room, but I decided she was the one who should leave. Why should I give up my bed? I got undressed quickly and climbed into bed. A few minutes later, Amy came in. She saw I was already under the covers, so she went to our bathroom and changed into a Zexy nightgown she knew I liked. She turned off the light and slid into bed without a word, moving toward me. Knowing she was cheating, I had no intention of being physical engaged with her. I turned on my side, away from her, hoping she'd get the hint. But she moved closer, tried to spoon me, and reached for my chest to turn me toward her. I pushed her hand away. "Want to fool around, honey?" she whispered softly. Suddenly, a disgusting image came to mind. I pictured my slender 51-year-old wife in Cody's bed, lying on her back, getting vigorously screwed. I imagined her grabbing him and smiling as he took what was once mine. Without turning, I pulled her hand off me and said, "Never again." "But honey, I know you're upset. I just wanted to—" I flipped over and glared at her. She pulled back, startled by the anger in my eyes. Even in the dark, I'm sure she could sense my resentment. "Of course I'm upset, damn it," I spat. "I just found out I've been a fool for months. If you need Zex so badly, go call Cody. I'm sure your young stud can handle your needs." Amy was shocked. I don't think she expected me to reject her like that. I stared at her for a moment, then turned back toward the wall. She didn't say a word and didn't bother me anymore. I had a hard time falling asleep, and I knew she did too. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. I barely slept and was still bitter about the conversation. Amy was in bed, but she wasn't asleep. I took a quick shower, and when I came out, she had already left the room. She had to be at school an hour earlier than I did. I've always been an early riser, even though I didn't need to get up early. I used to get up before her and sometimes make breakfast. Not anymore. Not after finding out she was screwing that idiot. I got dressed and cleaned up faster than ever. When I left the room, I saw her downstairs in the kitchen, making breakfast for a change. "Good morning, Cliff," she called out sweetly. "I've made bacon and eggs for you, and there's toast, too. Want some coffee, dear?" I ignored her greeting and her offers. To hell with her and her boyfriend. Without even glancing her way, I walked straight out of the house. "Cliff, wait, please," I heard her shout as I slammed the door, got in my car, and sped down the street. At work, I tried to focus, but I couldn't get her and that young idiot out of my head. I couldn't concentrate all day. Amy called me several times. I didn't answer, letting her messages go to voicemail, and deleted them without listening. She sent me some cute texts, which I skimmed before deleting them too. With all the calls and texts, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I made several careless mistakes while reviewing work and decided to take the afternoon off. I called a lawyer for a consultation. He was an older guy and saw me right away. What Amy had told me about divorce seemed to be true. I'd be screwed emotionally and financially. She'd walk away well off with a young stud while I'd be left financially strapped, supporting her. Since I never cheated, I didn't have anyone to ease the heartache. I'd likely end up broke and alone in a small one-bedroom apartment. Not a pleasant future. If I stayed with her, it wasn't much better. Sure, I'd still get Zex. She emphasized that. But it would be sloppy seconds and pity Zex at best. It was clear this younger guy was satisfying her in ways I couldn't. At 47, there's no way I could compete in bed with a good-looking, athletic 30-year-old or however old he is. And if I stayed and tolerated her affair, the courts would view it as me accepting her cheating. I wouldn't even be able to claim infidelity in a divorce. Worse yet, trying to have my own affair to compete with her would be a losing battle. Plenty of guys were eager to be with her, even younger ones. Cody was proof of that. At 51, Amy still looked good, with short dark hair, a trim body, and a friendly personality. I was an average-looking older guy with a receding hairline and carrying a bit of extra weight. Sure, I had a good job, and I wasn't bad-looking for my age, but how many women were interested in a middle-aged married guy? Probably not many. The contrast in our dating prospects was depressing. She was still attractive, and I was not. After a frustrating day, I went to a bar for dinner. I stayed as late as possible, but I'd never been into the bar scene, and being there alone was boring. I wanted to be at home with my wife, drinking a beer and relaxing by the TV, not drowning my sorrows at a bar with other lonely guys. When I finally got home, Amy was already in bed. It wasn't even late, but I guess she gave up on waiting for me. Not that I cared. I woke up early after another rough night of sleep. I left the house at dawn and went to Denny's for breakfast. I spent some time driving around and window shopping, just wasting time. When I finally went back home, I wondered if my cheating wife was there or off with that young idiot. Turned out she was home. She must have heard my car pull up because she opened the door and smiled when I got there. When she tried to kiss me, I turned my head and her lips landed on my cheek. She looked surprised when I pulled away and walked past her. I went to the den to avoid her for a while. Later, when I came out, I saw her in the kitchen. I grabbed a beer and headed to the living room to watch TV. A few minutes later, Amy joined me with a glass of wine. "Mind if I sit with you?" she asked, sounding pleasant. I noticed she had changed into a tight tank top that showed off her arms and shoulders and was wearing skimpy shorts. I could smell her spicy perfume. "Suit yourself." I was sitting on the sofa, so I scooted over to give her space. She deliberately sat right next to me. During the show, she became more affectionate. I could tell the wine was making her a bit tipsy, maybe even a little aroused, but she wasn't drunk. As she moved closer to my neck, I chose that moment to say, "I need to use the bathroom, Amy." I gently pushed her away, got up, and left the room. As I walked off, I saw her give me a strange look because I almost never turned down her advances. After finishing in the bathroom, I didn't go back to the living room. Instead, I went into the kitchen. "You coming back?" she called. "This show's getting good." "Not right now." I purposely stayed in the kitchen for a while. When I figured enough time had passed, I grabbed another beer and headed straight to the den, shutting the door behind me. As expected, Amy opened the door a few minutes later. "What are you up to?" she asked with a smile. "Just catching up on some work." "You don't want to watch the show?" "Better not." "Oh, okay." She lingered there while I focused on my computer. I didn't look at her, but I could sense her frustration. She was clearly puzzled. After such a nice dinner, she probably hoped things would start to improve between us. A minute later, I felt her hands on my shoulders. "What are you looking at now?" she asked, glancing at the computer screen and pretending to show interest. I had some paperwork open from an account I was working on, a complex financial spreadsheet she wouldn't understand. "I got busy on Friday and didn't finish this," I explained. "I figured you wouldn't mind if I missed the show." "Oh, of course not." I shivered when she began massaging my neck. She knew I liked having my head and neck rubbed, and she made the massage as suggestive as possible. I could smell the booze on her breath when she leaned down and kissed my head affectionately. I just ignored her. It took Amy another 10 minutes to realize I wasn't interested in her attempts to get my attention. Finally, she gave up and headed back to the living room. "Could you shut the door, please?" I called after her. "Okay," she responded, pulling the door closed behind her. I sighed in relief. Despite everything, Amy still had a way of turning me on, even after all these years. She knew exactly what to do to get a reaction from me, and it was working. But I was determined not to give in to her charms. I had no intention of sharing her attention with another man. It took me 3 hours to finish my work. When I finally went upstairs to bed, I found her already asleep, wearing a revealing nightgown with matching underwear. I figured she had planned to seduce me, but the wine must have made her too tired, and she dozed off. Sunday morning, I got up before Amy and avoided her all day, just like I had the day before. On Monday, her car wouldn't start, so I had to drive her to school. She asked if I could pick her up afterward. Throughout the day, I got several calls from her school. I figured she wanted to tell me she'd arranged a ride home, probably with her boyfriend. I ignored the calls. Determined to avoid that scenario, I left work early and arrived at her school before her last class ended. I waited as the students trickled out of the room. When I walked into the classroom, Amy looked surprised and not particularly happy. "Hey, honey, ready to go home?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. She gave me a sharp look. "I've been calling you all day, Cliff. Why didn't you answer?" "Sorry, I was busy," I replied nonchalantly. "I wanted to tell you I already arranged a ride home." "Oh, really? Well, no matter. I'm here now, so let's go," I said, brushing off her irritation. At that moment, a tall, athletic guy with dark hair walked into the room, moving confidently toward my wife like he expected her to greet him. I recognized him immediately. Her boyfriend, Cody. I'd seen him before, but hadn't paid much attention at the time. Now, up close, he looked even younger than I remembered, more like a college frat boy than a teacher. He was wearing sneakers, shorts, and a t-shirt that showed off his muscular arms and legs. He was an a-hole, but I could see why Amy was attracted to him. Amy's eyes widened when she saw him, and Cody looked confused. "Oh, Cody, she stammered. "I was just telling Cliff that she already has a ride home," I said, finishing her sentence. I kept my cool since I expected Cody to show up. He seemed surprised to see me. When he recognized me, he smiled smugly and glanced between Amy and me. "Oh, hi," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Cody Bakerfield." I ignored it and replied coolly, "Yeah, I know who you are." Trying to ease the tension, Amy said nervously, "Cody, this is Cliff, my husband. You've met him before." The young man's confused expression softened as he remembered me. "Oh, right, Cliff Wilson. I remember. Nice to see you again." "I'm sure it is," I replied coldly. "We met at Parents' Night a few months back. Amy speaks highly of you." "Not highly enough, I guess," I added, throwing a wary glance at Amy, who looked like she was holding her breath. "Amy, let's go," I said, wrinkling my nose as if something smelled bad. Amy began gathering her things as Cody turned to me. "Excuse me for a minute, Mr. Wilson. Can I call you Cliff?" I scowled and ignored his question. "What do you want?" "Just a minute of your time, Cliff. I know there's some tension between us, and I get that, but it doesn't have to be this way. Amy has told you about our friendship." So I just want you to know I don't have any hard feelings toward you. I respect the strong, loving relationship you have with your wife. Is that why you're screwing her?" I asked. Across the room, I heard Amy gasp in shock. Cody nodded sympathetically. "Yes, it's true. Amy and I are close friends, and we've expressed that friendship closely. But that doesn't mean we don't respect you or your role in her life. Neither of us wants to damage your marriage or your family. We can only be friends and nothing more. She's always said she loves you and only you." I thought, this guy's a smooth-talking idiot. Cody kept smiling as he continued. "I hope you don't resent my friendship with Amy. She's had a positive influence on everyone around her, including me. Once things escalated between us, we both realized we should have come to you before anything happened. That was entirely my fault. She behaved properly, and I took things further than I should have." "So you admit you seduced her?" I asked bitterly. "In a way, yes. She's an amazing woman, and I got a little infatuated. Because of my lack of self-control, I acted unprofessionally. But believe me, I never intended to hurt you. In fact, I appreciate you letting her work here so she can continue being a role model for the students. Her friendship has meant a lot to me, and I'll always value it." What a load of crap. I couldn't even respond. I glanced from this idiot to my wife, who was watching him with rapt attention. Her eyes sparkled like she was impressed with his respectful attitude. "So, if I asked you to stop sleeping with her, what would you say?" He shrugged. "I understand your concerns. I'd probably feel the same in your position. But as for ending our friendship, I'd leave that decision to her. Amy is a smart, passionate woman. If she doesn't want to see me anymore, I'll respect that. But if she does, I don't know how I could say no to her." I couldn't bring myself to hate this guy, despite how much I wanted to. I appreciated his honesty, but despised him all the same. As reasonable as he sounded, the bottom line was that unless I physically forced him out of the picture, he'd continue sleeping with my wife, whether I liked it or not. I looked away and saw Amy and Cody exchanging glances. I hated the adoring look on her face. She was old enough to be his mother, but around him, she acted like a teenage girl with a crush. Whatever feelings she once had for me were now overshadowed by her obsession with her young, attractive boyfriend. His slick words left me deflated. Sure, I could have punched him, maybe even landed a couple of good hits, but he was in great shape and would probably wipe the floor with me. That would have made me feel even more foolish than I already did. Feeling like a complete fool, I pushed past him and walked out the door. As I left, I heard Amy and Cody exchange a few hushed words. She quickly followed after me. "Cliff, wait up, honey," she called as her heels clicked on the hard floor. I hurried toward my car, not wanting to be anywhere near her. The whole conversation had left me feeling weak and humiliated. It was clear how much Amy cared for him. There was no way I could compete with a young, charming guy like Cody. I hated him for seducing my naive wife, but I was even more upset with her. Amy was quiet during the drive home. She said a few kind things, but for the most part, she just stared out the window, probably thinking about the scene that had just unfolded. I wasn't sure what she thought of Cody now, likely even more impressed. I knew my standing had taken a big hit. I came off as weak, lost, and hesitant, while Cody confidently spouted nonsense about his respect for me and admiration for my wife. What a joke. When we got home, I trudged upstairs to my bedroom, feeling more like 67 than 47. Amy could see I was depressed and tried to cheer me up, but it was pointless. She even suggested giving me a back rub and maybe more to help me sleep. I wasn't remotely interested in her touch. She gave me a sad smile as she changed into her nightgown and lay beside me in bed. The next night, I moved my clothes into the guest room. Amy was clearly disappointed. She argued with me to stay, telling me, "You're my husband and you belong by my side." She even promised me anything I wanted sexually if I stayed with her at night. I ignored her, and soon I was sleeping in the small guest bed. Amy went to bed that night in tears. The rest of the week passed in a blur. We went through the motions, getting up, going to work, eating dinner, and heading to bed separately. We didn't talk about the affair, and neither of us made plans for the weekend. Friday and Saturday nights were spent sitting silently in front of the TV, followed by sleeping in different rooms. I never knew if she was still seeing Cody. She didn't tell me, but I suspected she was. Even if I came home on time, she had plenty of opportunities to meet him after school. He didn't live far from the school, so it was easy for them to spend time together. Amy did her best to hide the affair, but I wasn't an idiot. After seeing the way she looked at him in the classroom, I was sure Cody was getting more from her than I ever did. Amy knew I was depressed. She stayed friendly, often asking if I needed help with anything. In the evenings, she sometimes wore revealing outfits and gave me suggestive looks, hoping I'd forgive her and restart our relationship. We kept our conversations light and casual, but the tension between us was undeniable. A couple of days after our confrontation, I came home feeling exhausted. Amy's car was in the driveway, but there was another one I didn't recognize. Inside, I found Amy and a woman lounging on the back deck in their swimsuits, sipping wine. Amy got up to meet me. "Hey, Cliff," she said cheerfully. She tried to kiss me, but I turned my cheek, which she seemed to expect by now. "Tough day?" she asked sweetly. "Not really," I replied, not wanting to talk. "Come out back and meet my friend Susan," she said, and I reluctantly agreed. Amy introduced us. Susan was short, with blonde hair, a curvy figure, and seemed friendly enough. We all chatted for a while, then ordered takeout and ate in the kitchen. The women drank wine, getting giggly as the night went on. When I said I was heading to bed, Susan teased, "Already? It's not even 11 o'clock. Amy laughed. "He gets tired early now." They both laughed, but I was annoyed. That night, I had an intense dream, but when I woke up, I was shocked. The sensation hadn't stopped. I looked down to see Susan giving me non-class execs. I bolted upright, pushing her away. Amy was lying next to me, smiling. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted. "We're just trying to make you feel good," Amy said softly. Susan added, "Come back. Let me finish. You'll love it." "Please, Cliff," Amy whispered. "I want you to be happy." "Screw you." I was furious. They had taken advantage of me while I was asleep. I stormed to the kitchen, splashed water on my face, and when I turned around, they were both standing in the doorway, now in robes. "What were you thinking?" I demanded. Amy spoke first. "We just wanted to help you." "Yes," Susan added. "Amy told me about your situation. I thought I could help." "I don't need any help," I shouted. "Everything was fine until Amy started cheating on me. She said nothing would change, but everything has." "I'm sick of it," Susan quietly replied. "I know, and I don't think she should have done that, but it's her choice." "Yeah, look where that got us," I snapped. "I know she doesn't want to hurt you," Susan said. "Easy for you to say. How do you think I feel, knowing my wife isn't satisfied with me? That she needs some younger guy to make her happy?" "All right, enough," Amy snapped. "I get it. We made a mistake. No need to insult us." "So now I'm the crazy one?" I shot back. "I'm out of here." I thought about leaving for a hotel, but decided not to. I wasn't going to let Amy chase me out of my own house. Instead, I locked myself in the guest room, blocking the door with a dresser. If they tried to sneak in again, I'd be ready. The next day, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. During lunch, I went to my lawyer and told him to proceed with the divorce. After explaining how my wife and her friend tried to ambush me while I slept, he suggested we file a restraining order to get her out of the house and keep her away from me. I agreed. 2 days later, Amy was served at school. During lunch, the process server walked right into the teacher's break room and handed her the papers in front of her coworkers. Then he served Cody, that idiot, for alienation of affection. After that, he went to the principal's office and served him for allowing Amy and Cody's affair during school hours on school property. We didn't have proof of that last charge, but we planned to gather witnesses about the exercise class and hoped Amy had left out some details. I was sure some teachers suspected their affair. Time would tell. Either way, it was clear they were cheating, and I was the one suffering for it. I got a call at work right after lunch. "Damn you, Cliff," Amy screamed. "You fool! I told you what would happen if we divorced. It can't be worse than living with a cheater and a sleaze. I'm done with you and your loser boyfriend. You both can go to hell." "I get why you're mad at me," she said. "You've made that clear many times. But did you really have to drag Cody into this? He's a good guy. Having this on his record will hurt his career. Tough. He should have thought of that before sleeping with a coworker. He's as much of a dirtbag as you are and deserves whatever comes his way. And don't even think about bringing your friends to the house anymore. You're not welcome either. The restraining order makes that clear, and I've changed the locks. No more bringing your girlfriends over to ambush me." "You're crazy! It wasn't like that at all!" she yelled. "Most men would have loved the chance to have two women in bed, but not you. I guess two sexually eager women are too much for a wimp like you. Susan was right. You're screwed up." Speaking of Susan, is she married? If she is, I'd love to let her husband know what kind of person he's tied to, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Screw you," she snapped. "Not anymore," I replied with a laugh. "By the way, your clothes are on the driveway. You might want to grab them before it starts raining. If you need anything else, talk to my lawyer." "You better not," she began, but I cut her off by hanging up. That night, Amy came by to pick up her clothes. I watched from the window as she arrived with her friend Heidi. She shouted a few curses and flipped me off. I just laughed. With her gone, I felt a huge sense of relief. Her cheating was no longer my problem. The kids called me a few times. Martha was angry with me. She knew about her mother's affair and didn't approve, but asked if I could ever forgive her. I simply said, "No, your mother isn't worth it." Robbie was more understanding. He realized his mom had messed up and didn't blame me for kicking her out, which I appreciated. I reassured both of them that I still loved them and would always be there for them. Thankfully, we still have a good relationship. The lawsuit against the school board didn't go anywhere. Apparently, Amy had been truthful. She never had sex on school property. She and Cody met at his apartment or elsewhere, but never at the school. We couldn't find anyone who even knew they were having an affair, so they'd kept it well hidden. However, the lack of proof didn't save Cody's job. He was let go with a reprimand and soon moved out of the area to avoid the gossip. Amy was also fired. She was bitter and blamed me, shouting during a few phone calls that her work problems were all my fault. She applied to another school, but they found out about the affair and wouldn't hire her. Martha later told me Amy was working as a receptionist at a real estate office in the next town. The divorce took a while to finalize. We had to sell the house because neither of us could afford it alone. I might have been able to, but it was too big for just me anyway. Amy only took a few things when she moved out. I got a 2-bedroom apartment near work and put most of the furniture in storage. Why did I wait so long to divorce her, you might wonder? Well, during those months living together, I quietly drained our joint accounts. Amy never noticed since she was too wrapped up in her affair. After the divorce, I didn't date much. I was cautious around women, and with the kids' school expenses and Amy's alimony, money was tight. I hadn't hidden much from Amy's lawyer, but after the split, I lived frugally, and my finances began to improve. I threw myself into work and am now nearing a promotion. After everything with my wife, I'm a bit hesitant about long-term relationships. I wasn't in a rush to get back into dating. I've met a few nice women through concerned friends. I'm not sure how things will go, but even without a steady relationship, I enjoy meeting women and hope to eventually find companionship with someone who's right for me. One Friday night, I was out with an attractive coworker I had met named Stacy. She's in her late 30s, divorced for a few years, sweet, fun, and good-looking. It was our third date, and we were having dinner across town at a nice restaurant. While enjoying our coffee and dessert, I noticed an older woman at a nearby table. She was painfully thin, with short blonde hair, dining with a much older, frail man who looked to be in his 70s, with only a little gray hair left. At first, I didn't recognize her, but after a second glance, I realized it was my ex-wife, Amy. I mentioned to Stacy that my ex was sitting nearby. Stacy looked over and seemed shocked. "That's your ex-wife?" she asked, amused. "She looks more like your mother than your wife." I explained that she was a few years older than me, 4 to be exact, and she must have had a rough time lately. After we split, I was concerned about how thin she had become, almost too skinny. "Wow," Stacy laughed. "She looks old enough to be your mother, and he looks like her dad. I can't believe she was your wife." I acted unfazed, but inside I was worried about Amy. She wore a sleeveless dress, and I could see her arms were just skin hanging from bones. The wrinkles on her face had deepened a lot since we were together. I didn't tell Stacy, but Amy looked unhealthy. I hoped she was taking care of herself. We didn't talk about her anymore. We finished our meal and were getting ready to leave. Stacy went to use the bathroom, and I waited by the entrance when I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Hello, Cliff," said a familiar voice. "Hi, Amy," I replied. I turned to see her, and I barely recognized her. Amy had aged so much. I wanted to say something polite, like she looked well, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Instead, I simply said, "It's nice to see you. How are you?" "Oh, not too bad," she replied. Her once sparkling blue eyes had lost their shine, and her face appeared thinner, with a sickly pallor in her cheeks that worried me. "I talk to Martha and Robbie from time to time," I said, trying to fill the silence. "They're doing well in school." "I'm glad to hear that," she responded quietly. "Yes, Martha visits occasionally, but Robbie not as much," I added. We stood there for a moment staring at each other, unsure what to say next. "Well, Amy, I don't want to keep you from your date," I said, trying to move things along. "He's not my date." "Not really," she said vaguely, avoiding my eyes. "Oh, are you still with Cody?" I asked, attempting to sound casual. A shadow crossed her dulled blue eyes, and she looked down for a moment before answering in a raspy voice. "No, Cody and I aren't together anymore. I haven't seen him since a few months after our divorce." She raised her eyes to mine and added softly, "But that's okay. I don't want to see him anyway." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah," she whispered, as an awkward silence hung between us. I was about to end the conversation before Stacy returned when Amy spoke again. "Well, it was nice seeing you, Amy," I said, trying to make my exit. "Yes, it was," she agreed, holding my gaze. Then, unexpectedly, she grasped my arm with her frail fingers, her grip surprisingly firm. "You know, Cliff, I'm really sorry about how things turned out between us. You were right about everything," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I was?" I asked, taken aback. "Yeah, Cody wasn't worth it. I see that now," she admitted, her eyes glistening with tears. "Are you married?" she asked, her voice softening. "I saw your date. She's really pretty." "No, I'm not married. Once bitten, twice shy, you know?" I joked, though she didn't laugh. She just looked at me with sad eyes. "Yeah, I get it, honey. You were always the one for me. I knew it back then, but I was too stupid to appreciate it." "Oh, well, I don't know what to say," I replied, feeling increasingly awkward. "Listen, Cliff, if you ever want to talk," she said, slipping a small piece of paper into my hand. Her wrinkled face watched me closely for my reaction. I didn't reject it, and for a brief moment her eyes sparkled like they used to, back when I loved her. "I'd really like to hear from you, Cliff. I know we can never be together again, and I know I ruined that. But I hope you're happy now. I know you weren't happy with me. Your date is beautiful. I hope she realizes how lucky she is to have you." Without waiting for a response, Amy turned and shuffled back to her table. She said something to the older man with her, who glanced at me curiously. Just then, Stacy returned from the restroom. "Ready to go, Cliff?" she asked with a smile. "I sure am," I replied. We left the restaurant arm in arm, and as we passed the trash can by the door, I tossed the scrap of paper Amy had given me into it. That was the last time I saw her. Later, I heard from the kids that she was living with an older man a few towns away, probably the same man I saw at the restaurant. They said her health wasn't good. She had developed diabetes. Fortunately, the man had enough money to take care of her. As for Stacy and me, we never got married. But I'm still doing well, working as an accountant. I see my kids as often as I can, but I don't see their mother. I guess part of me still feels something for Amy, but after everything she put me through, I could never live with her again. And I'm okay with that.
My wife cheated and wanted an open marriage, but I chose revenge instead and left her without a word. As I sat pondering the recent events, I couldn't identify any specific signs indicating she was being unfaithful. No matter how hard I tried, the unease I felt stemmed from numerous small details accumulating rather than one glaring issue. There was definitely something going on, yet I couldn't grasp what it was. I was certain of some mischief, but lacked evidence. I was clueless about who, what, or where this was happening, to the point where I questioned my own sanity. Am I reading too much into this situation? Perhaps I'm exaggerating, conjuring various scenarios of her infidelity. But with whom? I couldn't say. Yet my gut churned with uncertainty. I sensed rather than knew that something was amiss. Perhaps this marked the onset of an affair, possibly a one-time occurrence. The more I dwelled on thoughts and fantasies, the more self-assured I felt. It seemed like I'd been in this space for weeks, but how long had it been before I even slightly sensed something was amiss? I took another sip of my JD. The clinking ice signaled a need for a refill. Catching the bartender's eye, he nodded and smoothly exchanged my glass for another double JD on the rocks. He offered a faint smile, seemingly understanding my inner turmoil. He had encountered that expression attentive towards her. He didn't need to try so hard, I figured. She already had his number. The other patrons appeared to be simply passing time, while the rain outside further dampened the mood. Soon, they would each run out of reasons to linger in the comfort of the bar and head home. I still haven't made up my mind about what I'm going to do. So, what's going on? I turned toward the voice. She gazed at me, her eyes peering deep into my soul. Though I thought I opened my mouth to respond, no words came out. She stood in the dimly lit bar, water dripping from her coat as she began to remove it. What brings you here, Sammy? I was worried about you and had a hunch I'd find you here, so here I am. Do you want to talk? I looked at her, trying to regain some composure. Are you concerned about me? Why? What's happening? I scrutinized her, wondering if she had any hidden motives. Could I trust her? I took a sip of my JD and ordered her a drink, soda, which the bartender served with flair, smiling at the sight of Sammy. She caught his eye as he served her, flashing one of his charming smiles as his gaze lingered on her ample bosom, accentuated by her tight blouse. Sammy waited until the bartender walked away before addressing the situation. There was a mutual sense of uncertainty between us, along with an unspoken power struggle. I mentioned concerns about her recent behavior, indicating that she appeared burdened. I expressed a desire for her to share what was going on. When I looked into her brown eyes, I was reminded of how effortlessly she understood me, like an open book. This understanding between us was something I deeply valued. Despite occasional disagreements, we maintained a transparent and honest relationship. However, there were certain things we didn't explicitly discuss, yet we both understood them. She reassured me, saying she was fine and that our relationship was in a good place, alleviating my worries. I watched as she processed my words. It was clear she wasn't buying it. My heart sank, and I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. Sammy took a deliberate sip from her glass, her gaze penetrating into mine once more. Oh God, this is it, I thought. She set her glass down and interlocked her fingers, leaning slightly forward toward me. I tried to play it cool by asking what she knew and what I was supposedly hiding. She responded by suggesting we drop the act and be genuine with each other. This caught the attention of the bartender, who subtly turned his head to listen in. She then proposed we find a more private booth, as the current setting was too public. As we moved to a secluded booth, I could see disappointment on the bartender's face. Once seated across from each other, the tension was palpable as we prepared for our forthcoming conversation. I mentioned that I had competed in a tournament and asked for her opinion. She saw through my attempt at deception and reminded me that we had known each other for a long time. She urged me to confide in her, mentioning her familiarity with Sammy since she was 17. She noted that Sammy had always been around and had once had a crush on her when she dated Sammy's sister, CLA. CLA was 3 years older, and we began dating when we were both 20. Sammy and I always got along, much to the displeasure of her older sister. They were as different as night and day in many ways, but their personalities clashed often, evidenced by the numerous quarrels between the sisters over the years. 2 years later, CLA and I tied the knot and envisioned what I believed to be an ideal future. We both held respectable jobs and earned enough to lead a comfortable life. My sister-in-law, Sammy, had her share of fun in her late teens and early 20, and now, at 25, was seeking something more mature. I felt like she had outgrown her wild phase and had become someone any man would be fortunate to know. Claire and I have been married for 5 years. Well, we'll reach 5 in a month when our anniversary arrives, that's if we make it that far, I thought. Sammy is a very attractive woman, and someone I considered a friend, as well as my sister-in-law. Tears welled in my eyes as I gazed at her, searching for words to express how I felt, but still, her words, "I know," resounded loud and clear in my mind. She reached across the table, her fingers caressing mine before squeezing them tightly, a gesture of support and more, as I felt my heart slowly shattering. All right, Steve, if you won't tell me, then I'll say it. She's cheating on you. I'm pretty sure you know this. Of course I know. What are you going to do about it now? My eyes widened at those words, yet I still resisted understanding as I stubbornly tried to rationalize what I knew and what it meant. I didn't want to hear anything anymore. In my mind, if I didn't truly know, then it couldn't have happened, and thus it couldn't have hurt me. I wouldn't have to deal with it either. Sammy gazed at me, noticing the distant look in my eyes. Was it shock or denial? Steve, I love you dearly, but for goodness sake, wake up. I'm sure it's some kind of misunderstanding or something. I attempted to brush it off and deceive myself further. Suddenly, Sammy's eyes flashed with anger. She reached out and slapped me hard across the face. The bartender halted, wiping the glass he held. Everything all right over there? I raised my hand. Yes, everything's fine here. I touched my cheek, feeling the heat from the slap, and certain Sammy's perfect handprint lingered there. I'm sorry, Steve, but Sometimes you drive me crazy. You know how much I care about you, and I can't bear to see you hurt like this, so be wise and courageous. This is happening and we need to address it. I swallowed, rubbing my cheek as the seriousness of my situation sank in, the pain from her slap jolting me to reality. All right, I'll start. I'm sure you at least suspect something, but I'll continue anyway. A few weeks back, I was with her when her cell phone rang. She stepped out to answer it, which struck me as odd considering we're sisters. Darn it, what could she be hiding from me? I nodded, bracing myself for the worst. But as I sipped my JD, she continued. I just found it peculiar, so when I had the chance, I checked her phone. She's so trusting, there wasn't even a lock code on it. The call was from a guy in her contacts who introduced himself as Robert. I had no clue about any Robert or Bob, but I decided to keep an eye out for any recurrence. So, who's this guy, Robert or Bob? I inquired, trying to recall any mention of this name. I actually found out about him roughly a week later. He's someone she knew years ago, before she even started dating you. Anyway, it seems he reached out to her through some social network or chat site. Looks like they've been messaging each other for a while now, but I had no idea. All I sensed was that there were these little things happening that seemed to fly under the radar. Yeah, I get it. But it all seemed to fit into their interactions. Nothing overt, but it felt like everything was aligning for them. So, it's just two friends messaging each other, reminiscing about the old days or something? It seems that way. That's how it began anyhow. Are you implying something happened? Yes. And you're saying you didn't detect anything suspicious? Just that it felt like circumstances were working against us. Plus the glaring absence of opportunities for fun. Sammy regarded me with an incredulous expression, as if I were being foolish. What? I returned her gaze. Steve, I care about you deeply, but come on, snap out of it. Reality sank deeper into my foggy mind as her words grew increasingly real. Damn, I thought this was serious. Taking another sip, I mustered my courage. How far do you think it went, or do you know? Sammy met my gaze, her eyes gleamed, briefly averting before locking back onto mine. That fleeting glance told me everything I needed to know. When? How? Where? I queried hastily, my mind racing to catch up as anger began to simmer within me. The battle between reason, sensibility, and raw fury had commenced. I know she's seen him at least 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Initially, I wasn't certain, and it was only 2 days ago that I confirmed it had escalated. I was having lunch with a friend who works alongside CLA, and she accidentally let it slip. I didn't react then, and Claire hit it well, so I let it slide. Turns out she met him twice for lunch and at least once for dinner last week. Does this align with what you observed? I studied her, absorbing her revelations. There have been a couple of instances recently where I phoned her office to arrange a lunch meeting, but she wasn't there. Or she had just left. Was that when she met him? Then last week she attended a seminar that she insisted on going to. It was announced last minute and scheduled for after work. That evening she returned home late, past midnight, reminiscing about the event. She mentioned it had dragged on, and her team went for a drink at the hotel bar before leaving. I also recall there was no closeness that night, and she took a shower before bed. My thoughts raced, my mind swirled in confusion as I absorbed these painful truths, each one intensifying the agony and twisting the knife lodged firmly in my heart. To hell with all this, I suddenly spat. Sammy glanced at me, her eyes now reflecting concern. Steve, what's your plan? Don't do anything reckless. You don't want to end up in legal trouble because of her. Meeting her gaze, I sensed she had detected the shift in me. My face felt like stone, my heart a solid block of granite. My body braced for what lay ahead, and she could see it. To hell with all this. I refuse to tolerate this under any circumstances. It ends now. She'll pay. He'll pay too. Rage bubbled within me, my muscles tightened, fists clenched. I'd never been one for violence. Sure, I'd had my fair share of confrontations in my younger days, but I never sought out trouble. Sometimes you simply must confront the truth, which is precisely what I intended to do. It had been a while, but it needed addressing, and fast. Steve, whatever you're thinking, take a moment. Consider your options. Don't act hastily without a plan. Otherwise, things will spiral out of control. You need to strategize and prepare, otherwise, you'll only end up getting hurt, she cautioned. Her words tempered my rage, penetrating the rational part of my brain and making sense. Strangely enough, it helped me to regain some composure, realizing that my suspicions were indeed valid. At least I wasn't losing my mind. Is she there right now? I glanced at Sammy, noticing tears welling up in her eyes as a solitary tear traced down her delicate face. Yes, she's with him at this moment. That's why I sought you out, she revealed. Rage surged within me, prompting me to pound my fist on the table. Heads turned in the bar, drawing attention. I signaled to the bartender, who responded with a knowing half-smile. How did he know? Do you have any idea where exactly? I inquired, hopeful for some clarity. No clue, but tomorrow I'll meet with my friend again to gather more information. I know he's married with kids, but I'm unsure of his exact whereabouts. I'll do my best to find out. It might help, she responded. I reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, and wiped a tear from her cheek. Thanks, Sammy. I know this is tough for you, but I truly appreciate it. What's your plan? She regarded me with concern. I can't act impulsively. Not yet anyway, but I'll put an end to it. When I do, it'll be final, with no regrets. They'll both face consequences. For now, I'll safeguard what's mine and gather evidence for my next move. Sammy eyed me anxiously as I finished my JD. Catching the bartender's eye, he poured us another round. As he approached, I sensed Sammy wanting to speak. I motioned to wait until the drinks arrived, then handed the bartender a bill. Keep the change, I said, dismissing him. How long before you confront her? I pondered. I need time to strategize. Tomorrow, I'll make some calls and secure my assets. She won't get a cent from me if I have my way. It'll be tough for you to be around her, won't it? Yes, I realize that, but in a way, it's been that way for weeks now. If she hasn't noticed a change yet, she won't notice anything different. Sammy downed her drink in one gulp and rose abruptly. I have to go, Steve. Can we chat again tomorrow? I'll gather all the info I can. She donned her coat, and I stood, assisting her, sensing her proximity. Darn, she resembled her sister so much. Tears welled in her eyes as I kissed her cheek. Head home. I'll manage. I'll ring you up tomorrow. With a smile, she turned away, and I watched her depart into the dark, damp evening. Taking a deep breath, I settled back into my seat, pondering my next move. One thing was clear: they would face consequences. Swift, ruthless, and unforgiving. Memories faded after that. Somehow, I awoke in my own bed, mouth dry as a desert. My head still spun as I lifted myself from the bed. Rolling over, I noticed I was alone, with Kelly nowhere in sight. My senses gradually returned as I heard a noise downstairs. I swung my legs off the bed and attempted to rise. Oh my God, what did I do to myself last night? I pondered, staggering to the bathroom. I began to shake off the effects of my JD haze. Descending the stairs, pain enveloped me, and my joints protested. Everything throbbed. Peering into the kitchen, I spotted her. Hello, my love. What happened to you last night? Do you want to hear about it? I cursed inwardly. Just had a drink with an old friend. Got carried away, that's all. I seated myself, poured some orange juice, downed it, and poured another. Really? Who was it? Someone I know? My mind raced. No, I don't think so. It was Bob. Haven't seen him in ages. He was in town on business. Bob? A flicker of recognition crossed her face when she turned around. Yeah, probably. I mentioned him once. We were in college together, played football. He still asked about you. Claire seemed puzzled. Sorry, don't recall any Bob, but as long as you had fun, right? Seize the moment. She took a seat across from me. Recalling my conversation with Sammy, I looked her in the eye. So, honey, what did you do last night? Anything interesting? When did you get back? She met my gaze, lying effortlessly. Oh, nothing much. Finished work, grabbed a bite and drinks, home by 9:30. Started to worry about you, but remembered your late meeting. I knew she hadn't returned home by then because I was still there at 10 p.m. That's when I reached my limit and headed to the bar. Second strike. I've got some things to take care of this morning, so I'll shower and hit the road. I might be late tonight, so don't wait up. Bob mentioned he'd be in touch. We've got catching up to do. If he stays a few days, you'll have to invite him over. It's nice reconnecting with old friends. I'll make sure to do that. You must have some fond memories of him. She gazed at me with a blank expression, trying to conceal any reaction, but there was something there. I could sense it. Maybe it'll come back to me later, love. Now, hurry or you'll be late. Want me to drive? You had a bit too much to drink last night. No, I'm fine. I'll grab a taxi to pick up my car, thanks. Though. After downing more orange juice and a couple of painkillers, I got dressed and left the house 30 minutes later, while CLA was still getting ready. I had a hectic day ahead. One thing was certain, this wouldn't drag on. I gritted my teeth at the thought of CLA with Bob. My fists clenched. He'd pay, and I'd crush him. Work was chaos. Call after call to resolve line issues. My secretary handled some, but I had to attend meetings. By mid-morning, the rush eased, and I had a bit of downtime to address personal matters. Closing my office door, I delved into my finances. Within 15 minutes, I had cinched up my wallet strings and relocated some cash out of easy reach. Additionally, I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer to explore the option of divorce. With a few days still ahead, I figured it would afford me time to gather further intel. While it might not carry substantial weight, it could provide some leverage. Claire maintained her own bank account and credit card, so no action was necessary there. The issue lay in accessing our joint account, yet I swiftly closed that avenue, ensuring she couldn't access more than what remained. My personal account was safeguarded, with only a nominal balance, the rest securely withdrawn. Given our childless status, any split would likely be straightforward. I privately resolved that reconciliation rested solely on Claire's confession and plea for forgiveness. Any reluctance would spell the end for us. This realization weighed heavily on me as I sat pensively at my desk, reflecting on the day's events and decisions. Did I require further insight into Bob's character and additional evidence, or was my knowledge alone sufficient to confront them both? Interrupting my contemplation, the phone rang. "Hello, it's me, Sammy. How are you, Steve?" "Oh, caught up with things. Thoughts, plans, sorting through it all. Interestingly, I've made some headway. Got more intel on this guy from a friend. His name's Bob Stones, and he's married. I've also got his address and workplace. I obtained this information discreetly. A friend who knows CLA recently spotted her with him. According to her, they're getting quite cozy. She insists that despite their efforts to conceal it, the signs are evident." "Has she witnessed them together?" I inquired. "Yes, they were at the Rada the other evening after the seminar. They lingered after everyone else had left." "Well, it's a starting point. I'm certain there are CCTV cameras there if necessary. Anyway, please provide me with his details. I need to unravel this. It's gnawing at me inside, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep it bottled up." Sammy provided her details, and in minutes, I located his social media page and obtained his photo. That's when I felt like I recognized his face. It seemed familiar, but where and when had I encountered this face before? Glancing at my watch, nearly lunchtime, I contemplated. Calling Claire, perhaps to arrange a meeting or simply to stir things up. My heart sank as I dialed her number, the knot in my stomach tightening as I heard her answer. "Hi, darling," she greeted, recognizing my number. "Hey, sweetheart, what's your lunch plan? Any chance we can meet up?" "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I have an appointment in 30 minutes that will take up the whole day. I was just going to grab something quick at the grocery store nearby." "Everything okay? What's up with the meeting? Anything interesting?" "Just the usual routine with a new client." "It's Mr. Stones, I think." Her words cut through me sharply as if she was deliberately taunting me with his name. I held my breath for a moment, trying to keep my composure. "Nice, are you around?" Her voice came through the earpiece. "Yes, I'm here, you damned cow. That's strike 3. Both you and Mr. Damn Stones will face consequences soon. No reprieve, no mercy. It's going to be a complete scorched earth." Yes, honey, I'm here. Sorry, I got a little lost in thought for a moment there. Anyway, I have to run, and I know you have to get ready for your meeting too. Have a good time, and I'll catch up with you later, okay? Bye, love you. Bye, love you." I ended the call, seething with rage, and sat there gritting my teeth. When my secretary popped her head in through the door, "Steve, I'm heading to the grocery store nearby. Want me to grab you anything?" I pondered for a moment. "Yeah, surprise me. Just make sure it's substantial, hearty, with plenty of red meat. I'm craving something to really sink my teeth into." She gave me an odd look, then nodded before closing the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that her boss was acting strangely. He'd been holed up in his office all morning, business as usual, but there was an undercurrent. Something was brewing. She just knew it. Sammy dialed her sister's office and stepped into the lobby to find her sister exiting the elevator alongside a tall, dark-haired man. He looked to be around 30, a few years older perhaps. She recognized him from his photo on the internet. Bob Stones, standing before her sister, who seemed taken aback. "Sammy, what are you doing here?" Her sister's discomfort was palpable, her plans clearly disrupted. "I just thought I'd swing by to see you and maybe grab lunch," Sammy said with an innocent smile. "Well, Mr. Stones and I have a business lunch planned, so maybe another time," her sister interjected, extending her hand to him. "Bob Stones, pleasure to meet you." "Sammy," she replied, "how long have you known CLA?" Bob seemed momentarily puzzled by her question. CLA began to pull Sammy away. "Listen, Sammy, we really have to go. We have a meeting. Catch up with you later." Sammy grinned as she observed the couple exiting the premises and stepping into a waiting taxi. She caught her sister's glance as the vehicle drove off. I sat in my office, indulging in a hefty slice of pie laden with red meat, relishing each bite as I contemplated my next moves. With confirmation from Sammy that Claire had left her office, I phoned her secretary to learn she'd be out all day. Well, isn't this just peachy? Financial matters sorted, locksmith ready, lawyer primed. Tonight was meant to be the first step. I planned to toy with this couple before making a move. My old man's advice echoed in my mind. Keep it simple, be direct, obliterate them. Few words, but potent. Maybe something I'd forgotten, but it was coming back. It was imminent. That evening, I was at home when Claire walked in. She looked her usual beautiful self. Nothing out of the ordinary. She smelled normal too, until I went in to kiss her. The unmistakable scent of men's cologne lingered faintly. She noticed my gaze. I didn't say anything, kissed her lightly on the cheek and headed for the door. Where are you headed? Everything all right? I'm all right. Just got a problem to sort out. Heading over to Jerry's. He asked me to join a poker game with some work buddies. Figured it might help clear my head. Won't be out too late. With that, I shut the door, gritted my teeth, and hopped into my car. Easing down the driveway, I drove to Jerry's, parked in front of his house, and he guided me into his garage. Jerry and I go way back. He's always been a bit of a rebel and had run-ins with the law in the past, but with his combat skills, he's just the ally I need for this. You don't mess with a cage fighter. Jerry's a big guy, just over 6 feet tall and weighing about 198 lb, all muscle. Trust me, you don't want to cross him. With a personality to match his size, he's a force to be reckoned with. But we've been close pals since school. I gave Jerry a call earlier, and he offered to assist in any way, no questions asked. Exactly the support I need. We quickly slipped into the garage, and I changed into dark overalls and a matching ski mask. We stood there like two silent performers, not uttering a word as we climbed into the inconspicuous used car he'd arranged. There was nothing remarkable about it. As we strolled slowly across town to the address Sammy provided, we remained silent. We planned it all out in advance, so there was no need for conversation. Jerry parked the car near Bob Stone's house. There was no activity visible, except for a single light on. We waited quietly. When the front door opened, we observed him exiting, getting into his car and driving off. Jerry trailed him at a safe distance, and since we knew his destination, there was no need to rush or feel anxious. Parking at the training field was hassle-free. We remained in the car while Bob Stones retrieved his customary 50-ball bucket, a routine he apparently followed weekly. It's remarkable what you can learn online with the right search. We settled in, the radio softly playing Kenny Rogers in the background. Jerry glanced at me as the lyrics filled the air, then reached over and muted it. We sat, watching and waiting. The tension inside me was nearly unbearable. It took immense effort to remain composed and resist the urge to confront him directly, but such a move would be risky. As the parking lot gradually emptied, leaving only a couple of other cars, we both tensed when we saw him approaching his vehicle. Jerry stealthily exited the car and approached our target. Bob Stones was still recovering from his last golf swing practice. As he opened the trunk to stow his clubs, Jerry swiftly seized him and shoved him into the trunk alongside his equipment. A precise punch to the jaw rendered him silent. With Jerry's background in cage fighting, he swiftly gained the upper hand, subjecting Bob Stones to intense pain for the next 30 seconds. Satisfied with the punishment, Jerry shifted his focus to Stones's groin, delivering several blows until he cried out and lost consciousness. Jerry shut the trunk and swiftly returned to the car, where I calmly drove us out of the parking lot without attracting attention. Everything went smoothly, Jerry remarked, removing his gloves and mask. Thanks, Jerry, I owe you big time, I acknowledged gratefully. No worries, buddy. Anytime. I'll always have your back, and there's no way to repay what you've done for me, Jerry replied. That's what friends are for. At least your hands are intact, and there were no security cameras in the parking lot, so all in all, a job well done. Let's head back and kick off this card game. The others should already be there. We returned and indulged in a friendly game of poker for the next 4 hours, just for amusement with no high stakes involved. Being friends, we understood the unspoken rule: friends don't take advantage of each other. The atmosphere was pleasant. Claire sat with her arms folded, wearing a disgusted expression. I met her gaze with wide eyes and a blank expression. What? She snorted, clearly itching to say something. Go ahead, spill it. What's wrong? Steve, is there someone else or something else? You've been acting strangely lately. I chuckled, suppressing the rising anger. All in good time, Claire. Take a chill pill. I'm fine, my dear. It's just been a rough patch lately. It'll all be over soon. CLA studied me, my words echoing in her mind. She seemed uncertain, but there was definitely something brewing. We retired to bed. I pretended to drift off, apparently falling asleep almost instantly. This irritated her, fueling her readiness to confront me, but I remained passive. The following morning, CLA rose early to prepare coffee while I stumbled down the stairs, feigning a hangover. I stumbled into the kitchen. "Good morning, darling, how are you?" "Thank goodness, I'm feeling better now. Do you have anything for this headache?" She tossed some pain relievers my way as I sipped my coffee. She appeared composed. I noticed her phone on the kitchen table and wondered if someone had called her. Claire caught my gaze on her phone and I sensed her urge to grab it, but doing so would have seemed odd. Pouring myself more orange juice, I casually picked up the phone and saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "Needs charging, sweetheart. Wouldn't want to miss any messages due to a dead battery." I exited the kitchen to get dressed. Clay watched me, sensing that something was amiss, and Bob hadn't texted her this morning as he had been doing for the past few weeks. But he couldn't know, could he? She dismissed the thought. She hadn't been that careless, and it had only been a brief fling. There were a few lunches, dinners, a couple of outings, and of course 3 hotel stays, not that she was counting. It was just safe fun, she rationalized, and Steve would never find out, would he? This thought made her pause. When was the last time she and her husband had been carnal? She couldn't recall. Perhaps that's just how it was. She needed to address it promptly. She had become so consumed by Bob that she overlooked what was right in front of her, the one thing that could raise Steve's suspicions. I hurried down the stairs and dashed out the door, evading Keelay's attempt at a deeper kiss. Waving and smiling, I drove off. Around 11 a.m. for work, feeling playful, I decided to text Claire. "Apologies for today, my dear. I've got a lot on my mind, but it'll sort out soon. Love you." 10th. I reclined in my chair, waiting for a reaction. Shortly after lunch, Sammy rang me up. "Steve, what's the deal? What's up?" "Sammy, Bob Stones was discovered smacked in his car trunk by a golf club worker today. Claire mentioned it. She's pretty shaken." I reassured her these things happen sometimes nowadays, especially when it's someone we know, but we shouldn't dwell on it too much. "You weren't involved, were you?" "Wow, was he seriously injured?" "I can't say it's a loss, but no, I had no part in it. He's just a bit roughed up. Heard he has some cuts and bruises, but nothing serious." "Did you find out how she found out?" "Yeah, she had a meeting scheduled with him today, and his company called too. Say he was in the hospital. His wife made the call. Seems sweet, believable, but convenient. Maybe they won't have it so easy next time." "What do you mean, Steve? Accidents happen in strange places." That night, Claire wasn't home. Her car was gone and there was no note. I dialed her phone. "Where are you, honey?" I asked cheerily. "Oh, I'm at the hospital visiting a friend. I'll be home soon. I'm on my way." "All right. Hope your friend improves. Anyway, see you soon. Love. Love you, bye." I hung up before she could reply. 30 minutes later, she returned, looking worn out. "How's your friend? Hope it's nothing serious and she gets discharged soon." Claire seemed about to speak, then changed her mind. "Oh yeah, it's not too serious. She just took a fall and got some nasty bruises. We'll be back home in a few days. This coffee is good." "Yes, thank you," Sla replied, taking a sip. "The other night, one of my company's representatives was attacked," she mentioned, leaving the statement hanging for a reaction. "Oh God, really? What happened? Was he smacked and left in his car overnight?" "Yes, unfortunately. Bob wasn't severely injured. It seems like they just wanted to thrash him up for no reason. Nothing was stolen." "Strike 4. This is the same Bob you claim not to know, cow," I muttered to myself. Clay noticed my gaze and realized her mistake. She quickly tried to cover it up, but it was too late now. She knew I knew. Hurriedly, she made her way to the exit to change clothes. I suspected she might receive a phone call any second, but from whom? I realized I needed to reassess my plan as things were progressing rapidly. Calling out to CLA as she ascended the stairs, I informed her that I needed to step out for a while to handle something, assuring her not to worry and that I wouldn't be gone long. I drove to Bob Stone's home address and knocked on the door. It opened to reveal a petite, dark-haired woman standing before me. "Mrs. Stones, you don't know me, but I need to discuss something delicate with you. Can I step inside for a moment?" She regarded me with a mix of nerves, curiosity, and caution. "I'm Steve Ryland. My wife, CLA Ryland, is having an affair with your husband." I paused as a blend of realization and horror flickered across her face. Stepping back, she motioned for me to enter, leading me to the living room. "I assume this concerns both of them," she said, pain evident in her eyes. "Yes, unfortunately, they've been having an affair and I only discovered it a few days ago. I'm sorry to have to bring this to your attention. I also know that he's currently in the hospital." Her demeanor seemed to collapse inward, tears streaming down her face for several moments. "I suspected as much. I knew he was at it again," she spat. "I'm filing for divorce from Claire. She's had ample chances to come clean and I can't tolerate her deceit any longer." I'm not certain how long this has been going on, but the fact that she betrayed me is enough. I can't forgive or forget. Does this relate to the thrashing he endured last night? I met her imploring gaze and swiftly made my decision. I can't say I had no hand in it whatsoever. The whole thing caught me off guard, leaving me just as stunned. Whoever did it, I can't say I'm upset about it. Sorry, but that's how I feel. Could he also be involved with someone else's wife? Nothing would surprise me. Well, he can stay far away from my doorstep. I've had my fill of this. That's why we're back here, because he cheated. I left her, still seething, after providing her with the contact information for my locksmith and lawyer. Dear, oh my God, what a mess. I hopped into my car and made my way to the hospital, which was just 10 minutes away. I arrived even quicker. Passing through the lobby, I felt a lifting from my shoulders, almost allowing a smile to break through. Squeezing into the elevator, I ascended to the 4th floor, where a certain Mr. Bob Stones resided. Consulting the patient directory, I located his room in a side wing. Slipping past the nurse's station without notice, I entered his room and quietly closed the door behind me. Upon entering, he gave me a puzzled look. Approaching his bed, I examined his bandaged face. One eye was shut, the other bloodshot. He strained to focus. Jerry did a commendable job, I mused, scrutinizing him. You seem to be having trouble recognizing me, Bob. Take a moment to think. I'll wait, I said, grinning as he cast me a bewildered glance. I settled on the edge of his bed, peering through his facial bandages. I noticed a severely bruised eye and suspected issues with his jaw. It's inconsequential. Surveying the elevated bedding supporting his lower body, I winced. This looks awful. You must be in pain, right? Swiftly snatching the emergency button from him and tossing it beneath the bed, I playfully jabbed his ribs, prompting a squeal. Still pondering my identity, Bob needed a hint. His face retained its mix of confusion and curiosity. Let's see. Reflect on the married women you've been involved with and the marriages you've disrupted. Does that jog your memory? His eyes met mine, revealing a mind working overtime to piece things together. Another moment elapsed as I savored his evident distress and uncertainty. Need a nudge, Bob? Think about it. I'm tied to a woman named Claire. Does that jog your memory? Recognition sparked in his eyes. Got it now? I grinned, fierce as a pre-dinner tiger. He nodded in understanding. Great. Glad we've cleared that up. So, wondering about my presence here? Let me get to it. I'm here bearing a message from your wife. Pausing for comprehension, I mimicked the throat clearing, noting his impaired speech. She wants you to hear this. Here's the gist. Stay away. Don't show up. Divorce. Papers are coming your way. And just so you know, truly contemptible. A tear welled in his visible eye. Chuckling, I observed his restricted movement and leaned in to meet his gaze. I'm ending my marriage because my wife found pleasure with someone like you. This is just your starting point. We'll encounter each other again, guaranteed. I'll disrupt your life as you've disrupted mine. I won't relent, so be prepared to run. By the way, I'm not responsible for this, just a heads up. I wanted to keep him guessing. Raising my fist, I struck his exposed eye. I heard a crunch, not a big deal, then a sudden hit to my groin. He yelled and then blacked out. I stood up and exited the room. Was I content? Far from it, but it was a beginning. He'd lie there, realizing his error, unable to act. My departure was unnoticed. Had anyone seen, they'd have noticed my wide smile. I drove home cautiously, gearing up to address my other issue. My anger was contained. Once retaliation started, it was a path I'd eagerly pursue. While the end of my marriage deeply saddened me, her betrayal left no chance of reconciliation. My only solace, those who wronged me would soon experience even greater pain. I don't easily forgive. Bob Stones's card hinted at a future encounter. Pulling into the driveway, I noticed Claire's car exactly where she'd parked it just 2 hours prior. Absent-mindedly, I tapped its hood as I headed to my front door, contemplating this might be my final entry as a married man. A leaden feeling consumed my heart. Upon entering, the accumulated anxieties of recent days felt tangible, pressing down as I made my way to the living room. Approaching the door, I caught the faint sound of the TV. I paused, fixing my gaze on her. Claire was seated on the sofa, exuding palpable fear and apprehension, as though expecting imminent repercussions. She seemed to sense the culmination of our charade, though no words had been spoken. Her hands quivered as she tried to maintain composure while I stood observing. Lifting her eyes, fear was unmistakably present. Her lips moved, attempting to speak, but no words emerged. I entered, passed by her to pour myself a JD over ice, and set the glass on the table between us before sitting. Meeting her gaze, I detected her fear, coupled with a hint of defiance. Silently, I reached for my drink and savored a slow sip, feeling its warmth as it went down. My eyes locked onto hers without wavering. She waited. Let her wait, I mused, taking another deliberate sip. Maintaining my silence, my face remained impassive as I observed the woman I once deeply loved, staring back at me. Though my heart still harbored strong emotions for her, they were now tempered by the pain she'd inflicted without cause. It was time for her to understand my anguish. While I gazed at her, she found no hint of optimism in my expression. We had said so much already, wordlessly. Claire seemed to gather. Herself, standing taller as if choosing bravery, unaware of my knowledge and unable to bear the weight of my silent accusation. She broke the silence. "Where did you go?" Her eyes revealed her anxiety while I remained motionless and quiet. "Speak to me," she pleaded. I leisurely took another sip of my JD. Nothing like JD after a hectic day, I mused, noting her growing distress. "What's bothering you, Steve?" she snapped, frustrated by my silent response. "Fine, Claire. I'll share my whereabouts if you disclose yours. Deal?" Her eyes met mine, cautious and wary, each of us sizing the other up like wary boxers, uncertain of who'd strike first and wary of the counterpunch. I mentioned being at the hospital visiting a friend. "What's your point?" She reclined in her chair, arms folded, satisfied with her initial response. I leisurely took another sip of my JD. "Darling, I anticipated that response. Care to reconsider?" Her composed facade wavered, fear evident in her eyes. She was becoming anxious. I had indeed been with my friend, just as I'd stated. "Claire, what's causing the confusion?" "I'll clarify. I was visiting a friend," I began. "Though our relationship is recent, we're growing closer." I scrutinized her reaction closely. Despite her efforts to remain poised, the defiant tilt of her chin betrayed her. "Did I discuss her husband, Bob Stones? Does that name ring a bell?" I hinted. A change in her demeanor was clear. It seemed her husband had an accident and was hospitalized. Though not severe, he had suffered significant bruises. "He's recovering well," which is a relief, isn't it? I teased, watching Claire's face redden, sensing her apprehension. "So, what was your conversation with Mrs. Stones about?" she inquired, both eager and fearful to know. From what I gathered, her husband appears to be a consistent womanizer, or cheater. Upon discovering his infidelity, I believe she deserved to be informed. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, feeling a constriction in her throat akin to a noose tightening. "Are you all right? Can I get you a drink? Do you know about Bob Stones' indiscretions?" I took a sip of my drink as she struggled to respond, her words failing her. "Let me assist you," I said, looking deeply into her eyes, hoping she'd sense my sincerity. "I'm aware." Now, her eyes widened, and she covered her mouth in shock. Observing her face, I saw a mix of disbelief and surprise. Despite seeking some support, my expression remained impassive. "I'm aware of your involvement with Bobby, darling. I've known for some time, not an eternity, but enough. So, if you have something to confess, now's the time." Before leaving my drink, I rose to refill it. "You sure you don't want one?" I asked, maintaining composure under the circumstances. She nodded, and I poured us both generous drinks, returning to sit across from her. Claire took a long sip before speaking. It was meaningless, just physical. It meant nothing, really. It meant absolutely nothing. "Remember our vows?" Her mention of the common "it was just love-making" excuse ignited anger within me. "It was a fleeting moment, Steve. It just happened." "Seriously? Just happened?" Such things don't just occur spontaneously. It requires two consenting adults, planning and agreement. Don't belittle me. You and Bobby have been deceiving me for weeks, maybe even months. But it ends now. Both of you can go to hell. It only happened twice, and honestly, it wasn't that enjoyable. The idea was enticing, but the act itself was overshadowed by my constant fear of you discovering it. Well, I've finally uncovered your deceit. I hope jeopardizing our marriage was worth it. Steve, I am genuinely sorry. It was meaningless, and we can work through this. I'll make things right and follow whatever you decide. A sudden, almost manic laugh escaped my lips, causing her to look at me with a realization that this situation was grave. "It was an error, but we can mend it. I regret it deeply." "Sure, you regret being caught. Would you have stopped if you hadn't been discovered?" "I doubt it. All the usual excuses pour out so effortlessly from someone unfaithful. Your lies ever since this began are just as fluent. You may believe them, but I certainly won't. Honestly, the woman I once loved and married seems lost. I don't even recognize you anymore." My words seemed to cut through her pretense, and she realized the gravity of our situation. "What should I do, Steve? I'll do anything. Is it over between us? While I was away, I reached out to Sammy. She's aware of everything too. She'll be here shortly to pick you up. But where will I go? Are you throwing me out? Her shock became evident as she processed the situation. You're free to go wherever you want, deceitful person. Maybe back to the hospital to see your other man. I don't give a damn. What matters is that you leave. We're finished. I took the last sip of my drink and set the glass down with a firm thud, signaling the conversation's end. Claire stared at me, shocked, when a knock interrupted us. Rising, I greeted Sammy at the door. How did everything go? She asked as we returned to the living room, observing her sister, who was now crying uncontrollably, her shoulders heaving. Just get her out of here, Sammy. I hate to be so direct, but if she stays, I'm concerned about what I might do. Despite her betrayal, I still have feelings for her. Please make it quick. Thanks for handling this, Sammy, and I'll touch base soon. I poured myself another drink as Sammy efficiently packed Claire's belongings. Over the next few days, I heard my wife's cries while watching her sister pack and stuff her things into a few suitcases. Removing her from my home took less than 10 minutes. The true challenge lay ahead, removing her from my life entirely and healing. Retribution would aid in this journey. That's what I awaited now, along with another stiff drink. I gazed at the flames of the bonfire I'd lit in the backyard, consuming all of Claire's belongings. She had no place in my home anymore. Damn you, I muttered, finishing the bottle and tossing it into the fire.